I am Vincent, 69 years old, and for 4 decades I built an empire quietly letting my wife wear the crown while I wore the calluses. I took my wife to an elite charity gala. She left on the arm of a man who claimed to be a billionaire. He threw a single crumpled $1 bill at my chest and told me to buy a coffee while he took care of my wife. She laughed. But what my cheating wife and her arrogant lover did not know was that the dollar bill he threw at me was bought with my own money. And by the next morning that single dollar would be the only asset they had left. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their fake world brick by brick, let me know which city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that the quietest people always hold the most dangerous hands. The air inside the downtown Grand Ballroom was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and aged champagne. I stood near the entrance adjusting the collar of my 10-year-old off-the-rack suit. The fabric was stiff, the cut outdated, but I wore it out of habit rather than necessity. I scanned the sea of silk and tailored tuxedos searching for my wife Valerie. We had arrived separately because she claimed she needed hours to prepare with her styling team, a team I paid for. I finally spotted her near the ice sculpture in the center of the room. She was wearing a custom emerald green gown that cost more than most people make in a year. But she was not alone. She was practically draped over the arm of Conrad Sinclair. Conrad was 55 years old, a white man with perfectly styled silver hair and a smile that looked like it was practiced in front of a mirror. He was known around the city as a hotshot hedge fund billionaire. He wore a bespoke velvet tuxedo and held a crystal glass in one hand while his other hand rested intimately on the small of Valerie's back. They were laughing loudly, leaning into each other with the careless ease of two people who believed they were completely untouchable. I walked toward them. I did not rush. I did not storm across the floor or clench my fists. I simply navigated through the crowd of wealthy socialites until I stood directly in front of them. The music from the string quartet seemed to fade slightly as people nearby noticed my approach. Valerie saw me. Her smile vanished, instantly replaced by a look of sheer annoyance. She did not step away from Conrad. She actually leaned closer to him, anchoring herself to his side as if I were a beggar interrupting a private meal. Conrad looked me up and down, his eyes lingering mockingly on the frayed lapel of my cheap suit. He did not see a husband. He saw an obstacle he could easily step over. He reached into the inner pocket of his designer jacket and pulled out a single crumpled $1 bill. He flicked his wrist and threw the balled-up paper directly at my chest. It bounced off my tie and landed on the polished marble floor. "Buy yourself a coffee, old man," Conrad sneered, his voice loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "I will take good care of her tonight." I looked at Valerie, waiting for her to react. I waited for a trace of shame, a hint of regret, or even a basic defense of her husband of 35 years. Instead, she let out a sharp, cruel laugh. She turned her back on me, hooked her arm tighter through Conrad's, and walked away with him toward the private VIP exit. The sheer audacity of the moment hung in the air. For a decade, I had worn this exact same suit to every formal event. I did not wear it because I lacked funds. I wore it because every spare dollar we had during the early days was poured into a secret commercial real estate trust I built from the ground up. As the trust grew into a massive, invisible empire, I continued to live simply. I funneled massive allowances into Valerie's accounts so she could live the life of a high society queen. I paid for her country club memberships, her luxury vehicles, and the very gown she was wearing to walk away with another man. My frugality funded her arrogance. She mistook my quiet sacrifice for weakness. The surrounding guests stared at me, their eyes wide with pity and morbid curiosity. They expected a scene. They expected the angry, betrayed older man to scream, to cause a commotion, or to throw a punch. They wanted a spectacle. I gave them absolutely nothing. I stood perfectly still, letting the cold reality of the moment wash over me. The anger did not rise to my throat. It bypassed my emotions entirely and settled deep in my chest as pure, calculating clarity. I looked down at the floor. The crumpled dollar bill rested against the pristine marble. I slowly bent down. My knees popped slightly in the quiet space. I picked up the dollar bill. I used my thumb and index finger to smooth out the creases, pressing the paper perfectly flat with meticulous care. I folded it neatly in half, then into quarters, and slipped it safely into the breast pocket of my cheap jacket. I did not look at the door where my wife had disappeared. I turned around and walked calmly toward the main exit. I stepped out into the damp, cool night air. The valet looked at me with sympathetic eyes. I handed him my worn ticket. A few moments later, he brought my 20-year-old Ford truck around to the front. The engine rattled loudly as it idled next to a line of gleaming Ferraris and Bentleys. I handed the valet a generous tip and climbed into the cracked leather driver's seat. I sat in the dark cabin for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel. The silence of the truck was a stark contrast to the noise of the ballroom. I realized in that moment that Valerie had not just insulted me. She had handed me the ultimate freedom. She had severed the last string of my unconditional tolerance. I was no longer a husband trying to save a marriage. I was a businessman dealing with a bad investment. I reached into the center console and pulled out my cell phone. I scrolled past Valerie's contact name. I would never call that number again. I pulled up a specialized contact I had not used in over a year. It was the direct line for a 24-hour master locksmith who handled security for my commercial warehouses. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. My tone was steady, devoid of any warmth or hesitation. I need a full security crew at the main residential estate immediately. Change every lock on the property. The entry gates, the front and back doors, the garage access codes. I want the heavy titanium deadbolts installed on all exterior entries. I want it done tonight. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. I put the old truck into gear and drove away from the gala, touching my breast pocket where the single-dollar bill rested safely. The game had completely changed, and they had no idea what was coming. The morning sun broke through the heavy oak trees lining the long driveway of the estate. It was barely 7 o'clock when a black luxury ride-share SUV pulled up to the front gate. The massive iron gates, which usually swung open automatically via a sensor in Valerie's personal vehicle, remained firmly locked against her command. The driver refused to wait, forcing her to exit at the pedestrian entrance and walk the rest of the way. Valerie stepped out onto the damp pavement. Her custom emerald green gown from the charity gala was deeply wrinkled and stained with spilled wine near the hem. She looked completely exhausted, her carefully styled hair now a tangled mess, but her posture remained stiff with the arrogance of a woman who had never faced a real consequence in her entire life. She walked up the long, sweeping stone path, her high heels clicking sharply and aggressively in the quiet morning air. When she reached the massive double doors of the main entrance, she impatiently reached into her designer clutch. She pulled out her heavy gold key, a custom piece she had commissioned years ago because she thought standard keys looked cheap. She slid the gold metal toward the keyhole, expecting the familiar smooth click that had welcomed her for decades. Instead, the metal scraped uselessly against a flat surface. The elegant brass fixture she was used to had been completely removed. In its place was an industrial-grade reinforced titanium deadbolt glowing faintly with a red digital security ring. She jammed her custom key forward again, violently scratching the expensive metal against the titanium. It did not budge a single millimeter. She grabbed the heavy brass door handle and yanked it backward with all her strength, but the thick door felt like a solid wall of concrete. She took a step back, her initial confusion rapidly morphing into rising, uncontrollable anger. She kicked the bottom of the solid oak door with the toe of her ruined heel, leaving a dark scuff mark on the pristine wood. Her furious eyes darted around the porch until they landed on the newly installed high-definition camera doorbell mounted perfectly at eye level. She slammed the palm of her hand against the button, holding it down for 10 continuous seconds. When the door still did not open, she leaned her face directly into the camera lens, her features distorted by rage. "Open this door immediately," she demanded, her voice shrill, breathless, and echoing loudly across the empty manicured driveway. "Are you completely losing your mind? You are locking me out of my own house. I want this door opened right now, or I am calling the police to have you forcefully removed from the premises." Inside the quiet kitchen, I was sitting calmly at the marble island. I was wearing my simple cotton bathrobe, holding a fresh cup of dark roast coffee. The security tablet resting on the counter displayed her angry red face perfectly in high definition. I watched her mascara running slightly down her cheeks, but I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, deeply savoring the quiet warmth and absolute peace of my house. I pressed the intercom button on the tablet. My voice came through the porch speaker, calm, flat, and completely devoid of the explosive anger she was so desperate to provoke. "This is no longer your house, Valerie," I said evenly. "The deed has always been solely in my name, and as of 2 o'clock this morning, the security of this entire property has been completely upgraded." Valerie scoffed loudly, slapping her hand against the heavy door again. "You cannot do this to me. All my things are in there. My expensive clothes, my jewelry, my bags. I need to get inside right now." I took another slow sip of my coffee before responding. You will not find a single item of yours inside this house, I replied. Every designer dress, every pair of shoes, and every piece of jewelry you purchased using my money has been carefully packed into 24 industrial cardboard boxes. At 5:30 this morning, a private courier service delivered them directly to the main public lobby of Conrad Sinclair's downtown office building. I suggest you go there if you want to change out of that ruined dress. Valerie froze completely on the porch. The humiliating realization that her secret glamorous life was suddenly sitting in cheap cardboard boxes in a crowded public lobby hit her hard. But instead of showing any genuine shame or remorse, her expression twisted into a terrifying mask of pure malice. She took a step back from the camera and began to laugh. It was a cold, cruel, and mocking sound that echoed loudly against the tall stone pillars of the porch. "You really think you have won, do you?" she sneered, looking directly into the glowing red lens of the security camera. "You think changing a lock and moving some boxes makes you a powerful man? You are nothing but an outdated, pathetic old fool who has absolutely no idea what is actually happening under his own roof." I watched her through the screen, my expression entirely unchanged. She crossed her arms over her chest, shivering slightly in the crisp morning chill, but her eyes were burning with absolute triumph. "You spent 40 years building your little real estate trust," Valerie continued, her voice dripping with toxic venom. "But you were too busy playing the humble, silent martyr in your cheap suits to notice that the world moved right past you. You do not hold the reins of the empire anymore, Vincent. Our son-in-law Bradley does." I remained perfectly silent, letting her dig her own grave. Bradley, the white Ivy League-educated husband of my daughter Camille, was a man whose only real talent was failing upward. I had personally pulled him out of bankruptcy 5 years ago, giving him a fake director title just to keep my daughter happy. Valerie leaned closer to the camera, fully believing she was delivering the ultimate killing blow. "Bradley controls the corporate finances now," she declared proudly. "He has been secretly restructuring the entire executive board for the past 6 months. He holds all the digital signatures. He manages all the liquid assets and the offshore accounts. You might have your name on a worthless piece of paper for this house, but Bradley holds the actual keys to the vault. By the time I am done with you, you will not even be able to afford the basic property taxes on this estate. We are going to legally sell this house right out from under you, Vincent, and put you in the cheapest, most miserable nursing home the state has to offer." Valerie did not wait for my response. She aggressively pulled her cell phone from her designer clutch and swiped at the cracked screen with shaking, furious fingers. She dialed Bradley's number, pacing back and forth across the stone porch like a caged animal. I watched the live camera feed intently as she pressed the phone hard against her ear. "Bradley, listen to me right now," she screamed into the receiver the exact second he answered the call. "Vincent knows about us. He changed the locks on the estate and threw all my things out into the street. I need you to execute the financial contingency plan right this second. Do you hear me? Cut him off completely. Lock him out of every single corporate bank account immediately. Freeze all his personal credit cards and permanently revoke his executive access to the main servers." She stopped pacing, turned her body squarely toward the security camera, and glared straight into the lens with a wicked, highly arrogant smile. By noon today, she spat at the intercom speaker with total confidence, "You will be begging on the streets." It was precisely 2 hours after Valerie's hysterical phone call from the front porch of the estate. I was sitting behind my heavy mahogany desk on the top floor of the downtown corporate headquarters. The office was perfectly quiet, the thick soundproofing blocking out the chaotic hum of the city traffic below. I was calmly reviewing the latest quarterly projections when the heavy double-glass doors of my office suddenly burst open. My executive assistant did not even have time to announce their arrival. Valerie marched into the room, her ruined designer gala gown from the night before swapped out for a sharp, highly aggressive business suit. Flanking her on either side were my 35-year-old daughter Camille and Camille's husband Bradley. Valerie did not waste a single second with formal greetings or pleasantries. She marched straight across the thick carpet to my desk and violently slammed a massive stack of legal documents onto the polished wood. The heavy thud echoed sharply across the spacious room. She planted both her hands firmly on the desk, leaning over with a look of absolute, unadulterated venom. "I am not playing your pathetic little games anymore, Vincent," she spat, her voice tight with unhinged rage. "These are expedited divorce and asset division papers. You are going to sign over exactly 40% of the entire commercial trust, all liquid corporate assets, and the deed to the main estate to me right now. Or we will publicly tear this entire company apart piece by piece." Camille stood right behind her mother, her arms crossed tightly against her chest, her face a mask of cold, inherited entitlement. She looked at me not as a father who had given her everything, but as an annoying obstacle standing in her way. Bradley stood slightly to the side, adjusting his expensive silk tie, desperately trying to project the aura of a powerful, commanding executive. He puffed out his chest, looking down his nose at me with a sickeningly smug expression. I did not look down at the divorce papers. I did not look at my angry, cheating wife or my deeply ungrateful daughter. My eyes locked entirely onto Bradley. I stared at him with a cold, surgical precision that made him instantly shift his weight uncomfortably in his expensive Italian leather shoes. Bradley loved to boast loudly about his Ivy League education. He wore his business degree like a protective shield, parading around high society events and country clubs as a brilliant financial mind. But I knew the actual unforgiving numbers. 5 years ago, Bradley was drowning in massive debt, completely bankrupted by a series of disastrously stupid investments in fraudulent offshore tech startups. He was weeks away from total financial ruin, facing multiple severe lawsuits from angry corporate creditors. Camille had come to my house crying hysterically, begging me to save her husband from public humiliation and potential federal fraud charges. So entirely against my better judgment, I quietly paid off his $5 million debt. I absorbed his massive financial liabilities into my own private ledger just so his pristine social reputation would remain untarnished. To save Camille the sheer embarrassment of being married to a complete failure, I created a ghost division within my vast logistics empire just for him. I gave Bradley the title of regional director, a massive corner office with a view and a high six-figure salary. It was a fake kingdom built entirely on my charity. His division handled absolutely no real assets, made no actual corporate decisions, and was completely isolated from the core architecture of my real estate trust. He was nothing more than a highly paid mascot playing businessman with my money. Yet over the years, the fake executive title had completely inflated his fragile, hollow ego. He had somehow convinced himself that he was actually running the company. He truly believed he was the master strategist behind my empire. Looking at him now, standing aggressively in my office and threatening to destroy the very man who shielded him from federal prison, I realized exactly how far his profound delusion had gone. He was not a corporate shark. He was a bloated parasite who had entirely forgotten who owned the host. Seeing my absolute silence, Bradley decided it was his moment to take control of the room. He stepped forward, pushing Valerie slightly aside, and placed a second, much thinner file folder directly on top of the divorce settlement. He tapped his perfectly manicured index finger against the manila cover. "We are trying to make this easy for you," Vincent, Bradley said, using a slow, heavily condescending tone as if he were speaking to a highly confused child. "But if you want to be stubborn about the money, we are fully prepared to go the hard route. Inside this folder is a comprehensive certified medical evaluation signed by a highly respected private neurologist. It details a severe rapid onset of age-related cognitive decline, dangerous paranoia, and early-stage dementia." I looked at the thin folder, then slowly back up at Bradley. He smiled at me, a cold, predatory grin that revealed his true nature. "The doctor is a very close personal friend of mine," Bradley continued, his voice dripping with undeniable arrogance. "If you refuse to sign over the 40% to Valerie today, we will take this medical evaluation straight to a federal judge first thing tomorrow morning. Camille will officially file for emergency medical conservatorship over you. We will declare you completely mentally incompetent to manage your own personal affairs or this business. You will be immediately stripped of all corporate voting rights, your private bank accounts will be seized by the executive board, and Camille will be granted full legal authority over your entire estate and your health decisions." Valerie leaned back, and her eyes gleaming with triumphant malice. "Do you understand exactly what that means, Vincent?" she hissed loudly. "If you do not sign these papers right now, you will not just lose 40% of your wealth. You will lose 100%. We will legally lock you away in a permanent care facility, and Bradley will take over as the sole chief executive officer of this company by the end of the week." I shifted my gaze to Camille, my own flesh and blood. She did not flinch. She simply nodded in cold agreement with her mother and her fraudulent husband. They had planned this coup perfectly. They honestly thought they had backed an old man into an inescapable corner. I looked at the three of them standing there in my office, absolutely drunk on their own perceived power. They eagerly expected me to panic. They fully expected me to scream in anger, to violently tear up the fake medical evaluation, or to desperately negotiate for my own freedom. Instead, I felt the corners of my mouth lift into a very slight, very cold smile. I did not say a single word to my wife, my daughter, or the pathetic parasite she married. I simply stood up from my heavy leather chair. I left their ridiculous divorce papers and their fabricated medical threats sitting completely untouched on my desk. I buttoned my cheap suit jacket, walked entirely around them as if they were invisible statues, and exited my own office. I walked straight down the long glass corridor toward the private executive elevator. As the heavy steel doors slid shut, cutting off their highly confused and deeply angry faces, I pulled my cell phone from my breast pocket. I dialed the direct private line of Mr. Goldstein, my senior corporate attorney, and a man widely known in the financial district for his absolute unmatched ruthlessness. He answered on the very first ring. "Goldstein," I said, my voice perfectly steady and clear. "It is time. Execute the purge protocol immediately." The private elevator doors opened directly into the reception area of Goldstein and Associates, located on the 50th floor of the city's most prestigious financial tower. I did not stop at the front desk to announce myself. The receptionist, recognizing me, instantly simply nodded and pressed the silent buzzer to unlock the heavy oak doors leading to the inner sanctum. Abraham Goldstein was already waiting for me. He was a man who operated with the cold mechanical precision of a seasoned executioner. He did not offer me a drink or ask about my day. He simply gestured to the leather chair opposite his massive glass desk. I sat down and placed my phone face down on the polished mahogany table. "They made their move," I said, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "They brought a forged medical evaluation into my office and demanded 40% of the entire commercial trust." Goldstein leaned back in his chair, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. He folded his hands together, resting them on his desk. "Then they have officially crossed the threshold of no return," Goldstein replied. I gave him a single firm nod. "Execute the purge protocol," I commanded. The purge protocol was a complex financial fail-safe mechanism we had secretly embedded into the foundational documents of the trust over a decade ago. It was designed for one specific scenario, a hostile internal takeover. It required only my verbal confirmation and a dual biometric scan to activate. Goldstein immediately turned to his secure terminal, his fingers moving rapidly across the keyboard. He brought up the master control dashboard for the entire corporate financial network. The time for quiet endurance was officially over. We started with the parasite. Goldstein accessed the administrative firewall governing Bradley's so-called executive division. With 3 deliberate keystrokes, he completely wiped Bradley's digital signature from the corporate registry. We severed his access to the offshore holding accounts, the domestic payroll routing, and the executive expense ledgers. We locked him out of the internal communication servers and revoked his building security clearance. In less than 60 seconds, Bradley went from being a perceived regional director to an unrecognized trespasser in his own office. Next, we moved to the personal assets. "Bring up the secondary black cards," I instructed. Goldstein opened the private banking portal. A list of high-limit credit accounts appeared on the screen. There was Camille's platinum card, which she used to fund her lavish lifestyle under the guise of corporate networking. And there was Valerie's unlimited Centurion card, the golden goose that had financed her absolute arrogance for the last 10 years. "Do you want to place a temporary hold on these accounts?" Goldstein asked, hovering his mouse over the security options. "No," I replied firmly. "I do not want a temporary hold. I want them permanently frozen. Flag them as unauthorized and report them as stolen to the National Fraud Department. Let the system handle them with maximum prejudice." Goldstein's smile widened as he clicked the final confirmation button. A cascade of red warning alerts flashed across the screen as the banking system automatically registered the master override. Every single line of credit attached to their names was instantly suffocated. The financial umbilical cord that had fed their delusions of grandeur was brutally severed. They had spent the entire morning threatening to take my empire, completely unaware that I had just turned off their oxygen supply. Miles away from the cold reality of my lawyer's office, Valerie was living in a complete fantasy world. She was standing in the center of the city's most exclusive Cartier boutique, surrounded by gleaming glass display cases and armed security guards. Conrad stood closely by her side, sipping a complimentary glass of vintage champagne provided by the overly attentive boutique staff. Valerie was riding the massive high of her perceived victory. In her mind, she had already successfully overthrown me. She genuinely believed that Bradley was currently seizing control of my bank accounts, and that her 40% share of my massive empire was absolutely guaranteed. To celebrate her impending divorce and her new life of unrestrained wealth, she decided to buy Conrad a gift. She pointed her perfectly manicured finger at a heavy, solid platinum timepiece resting on a black velvet cushion. The price tag was a staggering $50,000. "Wrap it up," Valerie demanded, using that haughty, dismissive tone she reserved exclusively for retail workers. "It is a victory gift for the man who actually knows how to treat a woman." Conrad smirked, puffing out his chest as the sales associate carefully lifted the watch from the case. The associate placed the heavy timepiece into a luxurious red leather box, tied it with a pristine silk ribbon, and carried it to the checkout terminal. Valerie opened her designer clutch with a dramatic flourish. She pulled out the heavy metal Centurion card, holding it between her fingers for a second longer than necessary, just to ensure everyone in the room noticed its weight. She slapped the card onto the glass counter. "Charge it," she commanded proudly, leaning intimately against Conrad's shoulder. The associate smiled politely, picked up the heavy black card, and slid it smoothly through the high-end payment terminal. The terminal processed the information for 2 seconds before emitting a sharp, aggressive, and incredibly loud red buzz. The associate frowned slightly and tried sliding the card again. The same loud, rejecting buzz echoed through the quiet boutique. Valerie sighed loudly, rolling her eyes. "Your machine must be broken," she snapped impatiently. "Run it again." The boutique manager, hearing the commotion, quickly walked over and glanced at the terminal screen. His polite customer service smile instantly vanished. He picked up the black card, holding it firmly away from Valerie. "I am terribly sorry, madam," the manager said, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet store. "But this transaction has been forcefully declined by the primary account holder." Valerie's face flushed bright red. "That is impossible." She raised her voice, drawing the stares of other wealthy patrons. "Try it again." The manager stood entirely firm, looking her directly in the eye. "I cannot do that, madam. The bank fraud department has officially flagged this specific card as stolen. I am legally required to confiscate it immediately." Conrad instantly stepped away from her, his champagne glass freezing in his hand as absolute crushing humiliation washed over Valerie's face. My desk phone rang less than 20 minutes after the humiliating incident at the Cartier boutique. It was a restricted number, but I already knew exactly who was on the other end. I picked up the receiver and pressed it to my ear, remaining perfectly silent. "Well, well, well," the smooth, excessively arrogant voice of Conrad Sinclair echoed through the line. "I have to admit, Vincent, freezing your wife's credit cards is a remarkably petty move for a man your age. You must be hurting for cash a lot more than I originally thought." I let him talk. Absolute silence always makes arrogant men feel the need to fill the empty space with their own massive egos. "Valerie is quite distressed," Conrad continued, letting out a soft, highly mocking chuckle. "She genuinely thinks you are trying to play some kind of tough game, but we both know the real truth. Your little logistics company is barely keeping its head above water, and you simply cannot afford a prolonged legal battle. So, as a gesture of goodwill to the beautiful woman I care for, I am willing to do you a massive favor. I will personally buy out Valerie's 40% claim to your pathetic estate. I will give you a lump sum of $200,000 cash by the end of the day. You sign the divorce papers, walk away quietly, and use the money to buy yourself a decent apartment and maybe a suit that was not tailored in the 1990s. It is an incredibly generous offer, old man. Take it right now before I let my legal team crush you into dust." While Conrad continued to boast loudly about his immense wealth and his aggressive legal team, my computer screen chimed softly. An encrypted email from Goldstein had just arrived in my inbox. The subject line simply read, "Asset Verification Report." I opened the file and began scrolling through the dense pages of financial data. Goldstein was an incredibly thorough man. When I asked him to initiate the purge protocol, he did not just cut off the credit cards and revoke the digital signatures. He ran a comprehensive background check on the man who had publicly insulted me. I listened to Conrad's voice drone on through the phone speaker while my eyes quickly scanned the documents. Let me be very clear. Vincent Conrad was saying, his tone dripping with absolute condescension. "I deal in millions before breakfast. Your entire net worth is just a rounding error in my hedge fund portfolio. Do not make me destroy you over your fragile pride. Just take the buyout." I ignored his empty threats completely. My attention was entirely captivated by page 4 of Goldstein's report. It detailed the corporate registration and operating address of Sinclair Global Capital, Conrad's supposedly massive hedge fund. The primary headquarters was listed as occupying the entire top floor of the Apex Tower, one of the most exclusive and expensive commercial high-rises in the downtown financial district. The lease agreement attached to the file showed a staggering monthly rent of $150,000. It was a massive sum intentionally designed to project absolute power and unshakable financial stability to potential investors. Conrad was currently leaning heavily on that exact projection to intimidate me. He wanted me to picture him sitting in a giant glass tower surrounded by millions looking down at my old Ford truck and my cheap suits. He desperately wanted me to feel incredibly small. What Conrad did not know, what absolutely nobody in my ungrateful family knew, was the true extent of the empire I had quietly built over the last 4 decades. When Valerie mocked my frugal lifestyle, when Camille rolled her eyes at my outdated car, they only saw the surface-level logistics company that bore our family name. They had absolutely no idea that every single dollar of profit from that company had been systematically funneled into a highly complex network of anonymous shell corporations and offshore holding trusts. One of those specific shell corporations, registered under a generic alphanumeric code in Delaware, held the master deeds to over 30 major commercial properties across the city. As I stared at the scanned lease agreement on my computer screen, I felt a cold, profound sense of poetic justice wash over me. The Apex Tower, the gleaming glass monument to corporate power where Conrad Sinclair housed his supposedly billionaire lifestyle, belonged entirely to me. I had purchased the building outright 6 years ago during a market dip, paying the entire massive balance in cash. Conrad was not sitting on an untouchable throne. He was sitting inside my house, paying me for the privilege of breathing my air. The man who had thrown a crumpled dollar bill at my chest, the man who was currently offering me pennies to surrender my own company, was actively paying my mortgage. I leaned back in my leather chair, the heavy material creaking slightly in the quiet office. I let out a slow, perfectly controlled breath. The irony was so dense it was almost suffocating. My cheating wife had abandoned me for a man whose entire foundation of wealth was constructed on property that I owned. I adjusted my glasses and looked much closer at the financial addendum Goldstein had highlighted in bright red ink at the bottom of the lease agreement. It was the internal accounting ledger for the Apex Tower Property Management Division. I traced my finger along the columns of numbers, my eyes narrowing sharply as I processed the exact data. Conrad Sinclair was not just a tenant in my building. He was a severely delinquent tenant. The ledger clearly indicated that Sinclair Global Capital had completely missed its last 6 consecutive rent payments. He was currently in default to the tune of $900,000. He had been actively dodging the property management team, filing endless legal extensions and using fake wire transfer receipts to desperately delay his inevitable eviction. The billionaire hedge fund manager was completely broke. He was a massive fraud living entirely on borrowed time and stolen credit. I finally spoke into the receiver, my voice cold flat and dangerously calm. "Keep your $200,000, Conrad," I said softly. "You are going to need every single penny of it to pay your rent." I hung up the phone before he could say another word, severing the connection entirely. The arrogant hunter had just become the prey. I drove back to the estate as the late afternoon shadows stretched across the perfectly manicured lawns. The new titanium locks had successfully kept Valerie out all morning, but I deliberately authorized the front security gate to open when my daughter's luxury SUV aggressively pulled into the driveway. I wanted to hear exactly what Camille had to say for herself. I was sitting in the formal living room silently reading a financial newspaper when she stormed through the heavy oak doors. She did not bother with a basic greeting. Her face was flushed with intense anger and she was practically vibrating with spoiled rage. "You need to call the bank and unfreeze our accounts right this second," Camille demanded violently, throwing her designer handbag onto the antique mahogany coffee table. "Bradley's corporate cards are declining all over town. My platinum card is completely blocked and the bank manager actually had the nerve to tell me you reported them as stolen. What is wrong with you? Have you completely lost your mind?" I folded my newspaper slowly and set it aside. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at her. "I told you this morning, Camille. Your husband tried to steal my company using a forged medical document. The financial privileges are permanently revoked." Camille let out a harsh, bitter laugh, pacing back and forth across the expensive Persian rug. "You are so incredibly paranoid and pathetic," she sneered. "Bradley is the only executive actually trying to modernize this stagnant company. You sit around in your cheap suits with your outdated ghetto mentality, terrified of taking real risks. You think saving pennies makes you a genius, but you are just holding Bradley back from taking this family to the global level. You are suffocating his potential because you are bitterly jealous of his Ivy League education and his modern vision. I sat perfectly still, letting her toxic, deeply disrespectful words fill the quiet room. Her absolute defense of the man who had just tried to commit me to an asylum was disturbing enough, but what came next shattered whatever tiny fragment of paternal affection I still held for her. If Bradley is such a brilliant visionary, I asked calmly, why did the two of you march into my office today demanding a divorce settlement for your mother? Why side with Valerie and a strange man you barely know? Camille abruptly stopped pacing. She looked at me not with the eyes of a loving daughter, but with the cold, calculating gaze of a desperate corporate conspirator. Because Conrad actually understands wealth. She snapped loudly, gesturing wildly with her hands. He understands leverage and high stakes. Mom finally found someone who treats her like the queen she deserves to be, and frankly, we all benefit from it immensely. You think I did not know about her affair? I have known about Conrad for an entire year. The bold confession hung in the air, heavy and completely suffocating. My own flesh and blood daughter had watched my wife betray me for 12 solid months and actively chose to remain completely silent. I felt a deep freezing chill run through my veins. You covered for your mother's infidelity, I stated, my voice dangerously soft and flat. You sat at my Thanksgiving table, accepted my money, smiled in my face, and called me dad while you knew she was sleeping with another man. Why? Camille crossed her arms, completely devoid of any shame or moral guilt. Because Conrad made Bradley a massive promise, she declared proudly, as if she were revealing a masterstroke of business strategy. Bradley's division has been struggling because you constantly refuse to give him the proper operating budget. Conrad promised to inject $10 million of fresh venture capital directly into Bradley's department. $10 million, Vincent. That is real money. That is the kind of aggressive expansion this family actually needs to survive. Mom's relationship with Conrad was the absolute best thing that could have happened to Bradley's career. We fully supported her because we knew Conrad would finally give Bradley the heavy financial backing you always denied him. So yes, I kept my mouth shut. You were never going to give us that kind of capital anyway. I looked at the 35-year-old woman standing in the center of my living room. I looked closely at the expensive designer clothes she wore, paid for entirely by the logistics company she was currently insulting. I looked at the massive diamond rings glittering on her fingers, bought with the quiet wealth I had systematically transferred into her trust accounts over the years. I searched her face for any trace of the little girl I had lovingly raised, any glimmer of a functioning moral compass, any spark of genuine familial loyalty. There was absolutely nothing left. She was completely hollow, a perfect, terrifying reflection of her mother's bottomless greed and her husband's pathetic, unearned entitlement. She had actively sold out her own father's dignity for the distant promise of a $10 million investment from a man she foolishly thought was a billionaire. She had placed a literal, calculable price tag on my 35-year marriage, treating my public humiliation as a simple business transaction. At that precise moment, a profound and heavy silence fell over me. It was the absolute silence of a man who finally understands that a diseased limb cannot be saved and must simply be amputated. I did not feel the urge to yell or reprimand her. I did not feel the need to explain to her that Conrad Sinclair was a massive fraud who could not even afford his own office rent, let alone provide a $10 million venture capital injection. I did not want to warn her that the golden parachute she was desperately banking on was actually a lead weight tied securely around her neck. Explaining the reality to her would have been a complete waste of my breath. She had freely made her choice. She had chosen her side in this brutal war, and she had chosen incredibly poorly. I slowly stood up from the heavy leather armchair. My utter silence seemed to unnerve her slightly. She uncrossed her arms, her aggressive, dominating posture faltering for just a fraction of a second. Well, Camille demanded, her voice suddenly losing a bit of its confident, piercing edge. Are you going to call the bank or not? Stop throwing a childish tantrum and do the right thing for your family. I looked her dead in the eyes. My expression was as hard and cold as carved granite. I am doing exactly what is right for my family, I replied softly. You know the way out, Camille. Do not ever come back to this house uninvited. Camille scoffed loudly, snatching her expensive designer handbag off the coffee table with a violent jerk, and stormed out of the living room without another word. I listened to the heavy thud of the solid oak front door closing and the aggressive roar of her luxury SUV speeding recklessly down the long driveway. The moment the estate was perfectly quiet again, I walked over to the antique desk in the corner of the room and picked up my secure corporate phone. I bypassed my lawyer completely and dialed the direct private line of the lead partner at the most ruthless independent forensic accounting firm in the city. The senior partner answered the call immediately. "I need a full, unannounced forensic audit deployed first thing tomorrow morning," I instructed, my voice entirely stripped of mercy or hesitation. "Target the entire regional division managed by Bradley. I want every single ledger, every offshore wire transfer, every payroll file, and every deleted email recovered and meticulously scrutinized. Shut down their central servers and physically lock his entire staff out of the building while your team works. I want to know exactly how much of my money he is hiding." The partner confirmed the aggressive order without asking questions. I hung up the phone knowing that when you violently shake a hollow, rotting tree, the parasites always fall out. Exactly at 8 o'clock the following morning, a team of 20 independent forensic accountants descended upon Bradley's regional division. They moved with absolute military precision, flanking the main entrances and instantly locking down the central servers before a single employee could even log into their workstation. When Bradley arrived at 9 o'clock, casually holding his artisan coffee and acting like the king of the world, he found 2 armed corporate security guards physically barring him from his own corner office. His access badge flashed red. His demands to speak to human resources were completely ignored, and his threats to fire the security staff were met with stone-cold silence. I did not go to the office to witness his public humiliation in person. I had absolutely no desire to see his pathetic face. I remained in the quiet comfort of my home library, watching the digital updates roll in through a secure, encrypted portal. By mid-afternoon, the lead auditor, a veteran investigator named Harris, drove directly to my estate. He bypassed my corporate assistants and walked straight into my study carrying a remarkably thick red-bound file. Harris was a man who had seen decades of corporate corruption, but his face was entirely grim as he stood before me. He placed the heavy file on my desk and let out a heavy sigh. "We found it, Vincent," he said quietly, his voice carrying the immense weight of the discovery. "We traced the entire shadow ledger. He had buried it deep, but not deep enough." I opened the file. The sheer volume of fabricated invoices, ghost accounts, and manipulated routing numbers was absolutely staggering. Bradley had spent the last 3 years treating my logistics company not as a legitimate business, but as his own personal, unregulated casino. But the most damning document was not a simple corporate expense report. It was a highly detailed flowchart showing exactly where the financial bleeding originated. Harris tapped a thick black line connecting Bradley's primary division account to a series of offshore holding cells. I looked closely at the final destination of the stolen funds. Just yesterday, my daughter Camille had proudly claimed that Conrad Sinclair was going to inject $10 million of fresh venture capital into Bradley's failing division. She had aggressively justified her mother's vile affair by wrapping it in the grand illusion of a massive financial rescue. The absolute truth, meticulously documented in the pages right before me, was far more sinister and entirely pathetic. Conrad had never invested a single dime into my company. He had absolutely no capital to invest. Instead, the money had flowed entirely in the opposite direction. Over the past 12 months, Bradley had systematically authorized dozens of wire transfers, cleverly disguised as high-yield, speculative corporate investments. He had funneled exactly $10 million into a series of complex shell companies controlled entirely by Sinclair Global Capital. But Bradley was not a brilliant criminal mastermind. He did not have the technical skill or the executive clearance to steal from my highly monitored operational accounts or my heavily guarded private trusts. To find that kind of massive liquidity without triggering my immediate oversight, he had to target the most vulnerable pool of money available to him. He had hacked directly into the employee pension fund. He had actively stolen the retirement savings of the truck drivers, the warehouse workers, and the logistics coordinators who had literally broken their backs building my empire over the last 40 years. Men and women who trusted me with their futures were now missing millions. Bradley had callously robbed the working-class families who depended on me, all to secretly finance the fake billionaire lifestyle of Conrad Sinclair. Conrad had promised Bradley massive corporate returns and elite social status in exchange for the illegal capital injection. The two of them had struck a desperate, highly illegal bargain. Bradley desperately needed a massive win to prove to his wife that he was a real executive, and Conrad desperately needed liquid cash to maintain his entirely fraudulent public image. They were two desperate frauds feeding off each other using my hard-working employees as their personal bank. I sat back in my heavy leather chair, the absolute silence of the library pressing down heavily on my shoulders. A cold, dark realization washed over my mind, locking every piece of this pathetic puzzle perfectly into place. When Conrad threw that crumpled dollar bill at my chest in the middle of the charity ballroom, he was acting like a wealthy king, casually tossing a coin to a starving peasant. When he bought Valerie expensive dinners at Michelin-star restaurants, chartered private yachts for weekend getaways, and gifted her sparkling diamond necklaces, she truly believed she had finally found a man whose wealth rivaled my own. She had willingly discarded 35 years of marriage because she honestly thought she was trading up to a more modern, exciting billionaire who would treat her like royalty. But every single extravagant gift, every sip of vintage champagne, and every luxurious hotel suite Conrad had purchased to seduce my wife was funded entirely by the money Bradley had stolen from my own company. The absolute irony was so sharp it almost drew blood. Conrad was not a wealthy savior rescuing my wife from a frugal, boring existence. He was a completely broke parasite using my stolen money to sleep with my wife. Valerie had thrown away her dignity, her marriage, and her entire family structure for a man who was literally bribing her with her own husband's stolen assets. She was entirely blinded by the shiny artificial veneer of his fake wealth, completely oblivious to the fact that she was actively participating in the destruction of her own daughter's future and the financial ruin of my loyal employees. The entire foundation of their grand betrayal was built on a massive, pathetic lie. They thought they were completely outsmarting me, manipulating my wealth behind my back, while confidently laughing at my simple suits and my quiet demeanor. Instead, they had handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them all completely, and they had legally documented every single step of their own ruin. I closed the heavy red file folder. I looked at Harris, who was waiting quietly for my final decision. I did not need to think about it. Send the entire unredacted report to the Federal Financial Crimes Division immediately, I ordered. Let the wolves have them. Less than 4 hours after I gave that order, Bradley was sitting in his expensive, heavily mortgaged suburban home, desperately trying to figure out why his office security badge had been deactivated. He was pouring himself a generous glass of expensive scotch to calm his nerves when a black government vehicle pulled aggressively into his driveway. Two serious-looking federal agents stepped out, walked straight up to his front door, and handed him a formal, heavily stamped legal subpoena. The terrifying document demanded his immediate appearance before a federal grand jury regarding the blatant misappropriation of $10 million from a federally protected employee pension fund. Bradley's false bravado and corporate arrogance evaporated instantly. The terrifying reality of a 15-year federal prison sentence suddenly crushed his chest, making it impossible for him to breathe. Shaking violently, he rushed into his home office, locked the heavy door, and grabbed his cell phone. He frantically dialed Conrad's private number, his hands sweating profusely. "Conrad, listen to me right now." Bradley gasped into the receiver, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated terror. "The feds are here. They know everything about the pension money. They know about the wire transfers. You have to wire the $10 million back to the corporate account right this second before they freeze everything and arrest me. Tell me you still have the money, Conrad. Please tell me you can send it back today." While Bradley was barricaded in his home office having a complete nervous breakdown over the federal subpoena, Conrad Sinclair was sitting at a corner table of a highly exclusive Michelin-star restaurant, desperately trying to maintain his rapidly crumbling billionaire facade. I was not personally present to witness the spectacle, but the private asset recovery team I had hired provided me with an incredibly detailed report and high-definition security footage of the entire evening. Conrad's phone had been vibrating violently in his tailored tuxedo pocket for the last 20 minutes. It was Bradley calling frantically to beg for the $10 million back before the federal agents kicked his door down. Conrad silenced the calls with a trembling finger, completely ignoring the desperate voicemails. He looked across the candlelit table at my wife. Valerie was holding a crystal flute of vintage champagne, completely oblivious to the massive federal disaster unfolding right behind her back. She was still complaining loudly to Conrad about the humiliating incident at the Cartier boutique earlier that afternoon. She aggressively blamed the declined black card on a simple banking error, assuring Conrad that Bradley was probably just restructuring the corporate accounts to cut me out of the family business completely. Conrad forced a tight, artificial smile, nodding along with her delusions. but underneath his expensive collar he was sweating profusely. He knew the stolen pension money was gone. He knew the federal investigators were circling the drain. He had to keep up the charade for just a little longer, hoping he could somehow manipulate Valerie into liquidating some of her personal jewelry before the entire ship sank to the bottom of the ocean. He signaled the waiter and ordered the most expensive imported caviar and 2 Wagyu steaks. When the waiter asked for a card to keep on file, Conrad handed him a different platinum credit card, praying silently to the gods of fraud that this particular account had not yet been frozen by his aggressive creditors. The tension in his jaw was highly visible. He was a desperate, cornered rat pretending to be a fearless lion surrounded by elite wealthy diners who had absolutely no idea they were sitting next to a massive criminal on the verge of total ruin. The dining room was an immaculate display of old money and extreme wealth. It featured massive crystal chandeliers, soft live piano music, and floor-to-ceiling glass windows that offered a perfect unobstructed view of the private valet parking area on the street below. It was the exact type of highly exclusive environment Valerie believed she inherently belonged in. She took a delicate bite of her expensive appetizer, her eyes constantly scanning the room to ensure the other patrons were looking at her. She desperately wanted everyone in the city to see her sitting with her wealthy new lover. She got her wish, but not in the way she ever intended. The soft, elegant atmosphere of the restaurant was suddenly pierced by the harsh, flashing yellow strobe lights of 2 heavy-duty industrial tow trucks. The trucks rumbled aggressively down the quiet, upscale street. Their massive diesel engines growled loudly against the serene, sophisticated backdrop of the fine dining establishment. The trucks did not casually pass by. They abruptly pulled directly into the exclusive valet parking zone, aggressively blocking a line of incoming luxury vehicles. The elite diners seated near the windows immediately paused their quiet conversations. Their silver forks hovered over their porcelain plates as they watched the highly unusual and disruptive scene unfold outside. Valerie turned her head, her annoyance flaring instantly at the loud interruption. "Look at those hideous, dirty trucks," she scoffed to Conrad, taking another arrogant sip of her champagne. "They are completely ruining the entire ambiance of the evening. The restaurant management really should do something about that right now." Conrad followed her gaze out the massive glass window, and his forced smile instantly vanished. His heart dropped violently into his stomach as he watched 2 burly, unkempt drivers jump out of the truck cabs holding thick metal clipboards. The first driver walked straight past a sleek Ferrari and stopped directly in front of Valerie's gleaming white Mercedes-Benz. The second driver bypassed a Rolls-Royce and marched straight toward Conrad's black Porsche 911. Valerie set her crystal glass down on the table with a sharp, angry clink. "What in the world are those men doing?" she demanded, her voice rising in sheer panic as the first driver began unspooling a heavy steel towing cable. "They are touching my car." Conrad did not answer her. He sat completely frozen in his chair, his mind racing to find an escape route that simply did not exist. The harsh mechanical screech of the heavy winch echoed clearly through the thick glass windows as the massive steel hooks were violently clamped onto the undercarriage of their luxury vehicles. Valerie simply could not contain her inherited arrogance. She aggressively threw her expensive silk napkin onto the table, stood up abruptly, and marched furiously through the elegant dining room toward the main entrance. Conrad had absolutely no choice but to follow her, his face pale and slick with a cold, nervous sweat. The restaurant manager tried to politely intervene, but Valerie pushed right past him and stormed out the front doors into the cool evening air. "Stop right there!" Valerie screamed at the tow truck driver at the top of her lungs. Her shrill voice echoed loudly down the upscale street, instantly drawing the absolute attention of every single valet security guard and wealthy passerby. "Take those filthy metal hooks off my car immediately. Do you have any idea who I am?" The burly tow truck driver did not even flinch at her aggressive tone. He casually wiped his greasy hands on a dirty rag and pulled a bright pink repossession notice from his metal clipboard. He shoved the thick paper directly into Valerie's chest. "I do not care if you are the Queen of England, lady." The driver grunted loudly, entirely unimpressed by her designer gown. "This vehicle is a corporate lease officially registered to Hayes Logistics. The primary account holder permanently terminated the lease agreement this morning and flagged the vehicle for immediate repossession due to unauthorized personal use. You can clear out your personal belongings or leave them in the trunk, but this car is getting hooked up and coming with me right now." Valerie stared at the bright pink paper in absolute paralyzed horror. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. The financial safety net was completely gone. She whipped her head around to look at Conrad, fully expecting her billionaire savior to step in, throw a massive stack of cash at the driver, and make the embarrassing problem disappear. Instead, she watched as the second tow truck driver handed Conrad an identical pink slip. Conrad's leased Porsche, the ultimate physical symbol of his fake wealth, was currently being hoisted violently into the air by the heavy chains. His car lease was heavily dependent on the fraudulent offshore accounts Bradley was supposed to manage, and with my purge protocol fully activated, his automatic payments had hard bounced. Several wealthy diners from the restaurant had actually stepped outside to watch the commotion, openly pointing and recording the deeply humiliating spectacle on their smartphones. Valerie, the woman who had spent her entire adult life obsessing over her pristine public image, was now the main attraction of a massive, extremely public financial execution. She stood entirely paralyzed on the sidewalk, watching her luxurious lifestyle being literally dragged away on a rusty flatbed truck. The heavy tow trucks roared back to life. Their massive diesel engines belched black smoke into the pristine night air as they forcefully pulled away from the curb, taking the white Mercedes and the black Porsche with them into the downtown traffic. Valerie and Conrad were left standing completely stranded on the sidewalk, entirely exposed to the judging eyes of the city elite. The head valet approached them cautiously, holding his clipboard tightly against his chest. "Would you like me to call a private black car service to take you home, sir?" the valet asked Conrad, his tone laced with barely concealed pity. Conrad reached into his tailored tuxedo pocket, his hands shaking violently. He knew his remaining credit cards were completely maxed out and his bank accounts were entirely frozen. He could not afford a luxury car service. He could barely afford his next meal. "No," Conrad muttered under his breath, completely avoiding Valerie's shocked, demanding, and furious stare. "I will handle it myself." He pulled out his smartphone and opened a basic ride-sharing application. He rapidly scrolled past the premium luxury options because his remaining available balance could not even cover the base fare. He quietly ordered the absolute cheapest standard ride available on the app. 5 minutes later, a battered 10-year-old sedan with a severely dented bumper and a cracked windshield pulled up to the curb of the Michelin star restaurant. Valerie looked at the cheap, dirty car, then looked at Conrad in absolute disgust and utter disbelief. "Get in, Valerie!" Conrad snapped harshly, his fake billionaire persona completely shattering under the immense pressure. The grand charade was officially over. As she reluctantly climbed into the back seat of the cheap sedan, the worn fabric scratching against her custom gown, she finally realized the terrifying truth. The Hayes family bank was permanently closed, and she had traded her entire life for an absolute illusion. It was the morning after the disastrous repossession dinner. Bradley, utterly terrified by the federal agents who had visited his suburban home the previous afternoon with a formal subpoena, decided his only possible way out was to completely control the public narrative before the official federal indictment dropped. He managed to convince Camille to stand firmly by his side, manipulating her desperate desire to protect their lavish, unearned lifestyle. Together, they hastily organized a massive press conference in the basement-level media room of a prominent downtown hotel. They stood behind a heavy wooden podium completely covered in microphones from every major local news station. Bradley was sweating profusely under the harsh television lighting, but he desperately tried to project the image of a resolute, highly responsible corporate executive. He looked directly into the camera lenses and confidently declared that I, Vincent Hayes, was suffering from severe, highly dangerous early-onset dementia. He blatantly lied to the viewing public, claiming that my rapidly declining mental state had caused me to act erratically and secretly embezzle millions of dollars from my own hard-working employees' pension fund. Camille stood right next to him, wearing a somber black designer dress and wiping away entirely fake tears with a tissue. She told the reporters that it absolutely broke her heart to see her father destroy the family legacy, but they were bravely stepping up to save the logistics company and protect the innocent workers from my supposedly criminal behavior. It was a bold, incredibly desperate, and entirely suicidal public relations stunt designed to ruin my reputation before I could officially ruin theirs. They honestly thought they could spin the media to their advantage, play the absolute victims, and force me to back down from the forensic audit. I did not watch this pathetic display on a television screen from the comfort of my estate. I was already inside the hotel building. I walked quietly through the heavy double doors at the absolute back of the crowded media room, just as Bradley was reaching the emotional climax of his completely fabricated speech. I wore the exact same cheap, outdated suit I had worn to the charity gala. I did not storm down the center aisle to cause a dramatic scene. I did not grab a microphone to loudly defend my honor, and I did not scream at my daughter for her blatant, unforgivable lies in front of the cameras. I simply stood at the back of the room holding the thick red file folder that the senior forensic auditor had delivered directly to my hands the day before. The room was packed tightly with eager reporters rapidly typing on their laptops and camera operators zooming in closely on Bradley's sweating, arrogant face. I scanned the crowded room until my eyes locked onto a specific woman sitting in the second row. She was the senior financial investigative reporter for the city's largest independent newspaper, a woman widely known for aggressively dismantling corrupt corporate executives without an ounce of mercy or hesitation. I walked slowly and entirely silently down the side aisle, keeping to the shadows until I reached her chair. I did not say a single word to her. I simply placed the heavy red folder directly onto her lap, tapped the front cover once with my index finger to ensure she looked at it, and took a deliberate step back into the aisle. She looked up at me slightly confused by the sudden silent interruption, and then she looked down at the official embossed seal of the independent forensic accounting firm stamped clearly on the front of the file. Her professional curiosity instantly replaced her initial confusion. She immediately flipped open the heavy cover and began rapidly scanning the top page, her eyes widening as she processed the irrefutable data. Bradley was still speaking loudly into the cluster of microphones, earnestly promising the viewing public that he and Camille would personally oversee the immediate recovery of the missing employee pension funds. The senior investigative journalist did not wait for him to finish his grand, deceptive sentence. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly and aggressively against the hard floor, instantly drawing the attention of every single television camera in the room. "Excuse me, Mr. Hayes," she called out, her highly authoritative voice cutting sharply through the thick air of the press conference. "You just publicly stated that your father-in-law was directly responsible for the missing $10 million. However, I am currently holding a certified forensic audit completed less than 24 hours ago that tells a completely different story." She did not ask him a polite question. She immediately started reading the highly confidential documents aloud for the entire room to hear. She read the exact transaction dates, the specific dollar amounts, and the highly encrypted offshore routing numbers. She clearly and loudly stated that the digital authorizations for every single fraudulent wire transfer originated directly from Bradley's personal executive computer terminal, completely bypassing my central security clearance. Furthermore, she continued, her voice echoing loudly over the sudden frantic whispering of the other shocked reporters. These certified documents explicitly prove that the stolen pension funds were not hidden by Vincent Hayes. They were systematically wired into a complex offshore shell corporation completely controlled by Sinclair Global Capital. Bradley abruptly stopped speaking mid-sentence. His jaw dropped open, but absolutely no sound came out. His fake, highly confident executive persona completely shattered into a million irreversible pieces right there on the stage. The blood aggressively drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost standing in front of a firing squad. Camille grabbed his arm tightly, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated panic as the bright flashes of a dozen cameras suddenly blinded them. The reporters in the room instantly erupted into a chaotic frenzy, shouting highly aggressive questions at the podium, demanding to know exactly why Bradley had secretly funded Conrad Sinclair with stolen employee retirement money. Bradley desperately backed away from the heavy wooden podium, violently knocking over a tall microphone stand in his blind, overwhelming panic. He grabbed Camille tightly by the hand, trying to forcefully drag her toward the emergency exit located right behind the stage to completely avoid the massive swarm of aggressive reporters rushing the platform. He did not make it past the heavy velvet curtains. The heavy wooden doors at the side of the stage violently swung open, hitting the wall with a massive thud. Two tall federal agents dressed in dark suits and tactical windbreakers with the large yellow letters FBI printed across the back stepped directly into his immediate path. They did not politely ask him to come quietly. They did not care about the flashing camera lenses or the fact that they were currently being broadcast on live local television. The lead agent forcefully grabbed Bradley by the shoulder, spinning him around aggressively to face the entire media pool. "Bradley Hayes," the agent announced loudly, his deep voice booming over the absolute chaos of the press room. "You are under federal arrest for massive corporate wire fraud, embezzlement, and the deliberate theft of protected employee pension funds." The agent aggressively pulled Bradley's shaking arms firmly behind his back and the sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed clearly through the room. Valerie stood entirely frozen near the back of the chaotic press room, watching in sheer horror as the federal agents aggressively dragged her son-in-law out the side door in heavy steel handcuffs. The blinding flashes of the camera lenses and the deafening shouts of the aggressive reporters completely terrified her. She knew instantly that the stolen pension money was permanently gone, and that her own name might be deeply entangled in Bradley's fraudulent corporate paperwork. Absolute panic entirely consumed her. She did not stay to help her daughter Camille, who was currently sobbing uncontrollably on the stage as the media swarmed her. Instead, Valerie turned and practically sprinted out the rear emergency exit, her high heels clicking frantically against the cold concrete stairs. Since I had forcefully repossessed her luxury Mercedes the night before, she was forced to hail a dirty city taxi on the busy street corner. She climbed into the cramped back seat, her hands shaking violently as she gave the driver the address to the Apex Tower. In her desperate, highly delusional mind, Conrad Sinclair was still her ultimate safety net. She genuinely believed she could run to his luxurious downtown penthouse, collapse into his wealthy arms, and let his massive team of hedge fund lawyers clean up the entire federal disaster. She honestly thought his millions would protect her from the federal investigators and my calculated retaliation. The taxi ride felt like an absolute eternity as it navigated through the heavy downtown traffic. When the cab finally pulled up to the gleaming glass facade of the Apex Tower, Valerie did not even wait for the driver to fully stop. She threw a crumpled $20 bill over the front seat and rushed frantically through the revolving doors, completely ignoring the concierge desk. She desperately pressed the button for the private express elevator, praying that the gleaming metal doors would close fast enough to shut out the rapidly collapsing reality of her ruined life. The high-speed elevator shot smoothly up to the 50th floor, carrying Valerie toward what she firmly believed was her absolute sanctuary. The soft ding of the elevator arrival chime echoed in the small cabin, and the polished metal doors slid open. Valerie stepped out, fully expecting to walk directly into the sprawling, custom-designed foyer of Conrad Sinclair's multi-million-dollar penthouse. Instead, she stepped straight into a scene of absolute chaotic devastation. The massive double oak doors leading into the penthouse were entirely wrapped in thick steel chains and secured with a heavy industrial padlock. The luxurious private hallway was completely crowded with armed city police officers, building security personnel, and aggressive moving men carrying large, heavy-duty plastic crates. Conrad was standing in the dead center of the hallway, looking entirely disheveled and completely pathetic. His custom velvet jacket was gone, replaced by a wrinkled dress shirt completely soaked in nervous sweat. He was loudly arguing with two uniformed officers, wildly gesturing with his hands and aggressively demanding to speak to his lawyers. The officers looked completely unimpressed, treating him exactly like the common street criminal he truly was. Valerie stood entirely paralyzed by the elevator bank. She watched in sheer horror as the moving men carelessly hauled Conrad's expensive designer furniture, his custom artwork, and his tailored silk suits out of the penthouse and dumped them aggressively into the service elevator. The luxurious, untouchable life she thought she was escaping to was literally being dismantled right in front of her eyes. Conrad suddenly noticed her standing there, his face instantly drained of whatever fake confidence he was desperately trying to project. He did not run to comfort her. He did not offer her a warm embrace or assure her that everything was going to be perfectly fine. He actually took a physical step back, looking at her with a mixture of absolute dread and rising panic. Valerie slowly walked toward him, her legs feeling like heavy blocks of lead. She looked at the thick chains wrapped tightly around the door handles, and then looked directly at the senior property manager, who was standing nearby holding a massive stack of official legal documents. "What is happening here?" Valerie demanded, her voice shaking uncontrollably. "Why are they chaining the doors to your apartment? Conrad, tell them to stop this immediately." Conrad could not speak. He simply stared at the floor, breathing heavily like a trapped, cornered animal. The senior property manager, a strict professional who had directly received my specific eviction orders earlier that morning, turned to face Valerie. He did not offer her a polite smile or an ounce of sympathy. He simply pulled a bright yellow legal document from his heavy stack and held it out so she could clearly read the bold black text printed across the top. "This is a court-ordered immediate commercial eviction, madam," the property manager stated loudly, his voice carrying clearly down the crowded hallway. Mr. Sinclair is currently in default of 6 consecutive months of rent. He owes the building ownership group nearly $1 million in back payments, late fees, and fraudulent wire transfer penalties. He has been completely evicted from the premises, and all remaining physical assets inside the penthouse are being legally seized by the ownership group to cover a fraction of his massive debt. Valerie shook her head in absolute disbelief, stepping away from the yellow paper. "That is completely impossible," she snapped aggressively, desperately clinging to the very last shred of her shattered illusion. "Conrad owns an international hedge fund. He is a billionaire. He owns this entire penthouse." The property manager let out a dry, entirely humorless chuckle. He reached into his folder again and pulled out the master lease agreement, the exact same document Goldstein had sent to my secure computer terminal earlier that afternoon. He thrust the paper directly toward Valerie's face, pointing a thick finger at the signature line at the very bottom of the page. "Mr. Sinclair does not own anything," the manager corrected her sharply. "He is a tenant. And as of today, he is a highly delinquent, evicted tenant. If you do not believe me, believe. You can read the name of the actual building owner right here." Valerie leaned forward, her eyes frantically scanning the dense legal text. She looked at the bold print listed directly under the Property Holding Corporation. She read the name once, blinked hard, and read it again. The heavy, suffocating weight of the absolute truth crashed down on her chest. The legal owner of the Apex Tower, the landlord who had just aggressively kicked her fake billionaire lover out into the street, was Vincent Hayes. My name was printed perfectly on the eviction notice. Valerie gasped loudly, stumbling backward as if she had been physically struck by an invisible force. She looked at Conrad, her eyes wide with sheer terror and profound betrayal. "You are completely broke," she whispered, the devastating realization finally sinking in. "You used me to get to my husband's money because you have absolutely nothing." Conrad's pathetic, cowardly demeanor instantly vanished, entirely replaced by a vicious, cornered rage. He lunged forward, his face contorted into a mask of pure hatred. He raised his hand and slapped Valerie aggressively across the face. The sharp crack echoed loudly in the hallway, causing the police officers to instantly draw their weapons and shout commands. "It is your fault, you stupid, arrogant woman!" Conrad screamed at her, spit flying from his lips as the police officers violently tackled him to the luxurious carpet. "If you and your idiot son-in-law had just kept the money flowing quietly, none of this would be happening. You ruined everything." The heavy grandfather's clock in the main hallway chimed midnight. A brutal, unforgiving rainstorm had moved over the city, thrashing against the large glass windows of my estate. I was sitting in the dark, watching the violent lightning illuminate the manicured grounds, when the advanced security system suddenly blared a proximity warning. I tapped the glowing tablet resting on the side table. The high-definition night vision camera displayed a solitary figure standing aggressively outside the heavy iron pedestrian gate. It was Camille. She was completely soaked, her expensive black designer dress clinging to her shivering frame, her perfectly styled hair plastered flat against her face. Her luxury SUV was nowhere in sight, likely abandoned or already flagged by aggressive creditors. With her husband sitting terrified in a cold federal holding cell and her platinum credit cards entirely frozen by my purge protocol, she had rapidly exhausted her superficial list of high society friends. Nobody wanted to answer a midnight phone call from the wife of a highly publicized federal criminal. She had absolutely nowhere else to go. I pressed a button on the tablet remotely, unlocking the outer gate, and watched her sprint frantically up the long, sweeping stone driveway through the pouring rain. By the time she reached the main porch, she was gasping heavily for air, violently banging her fists against the solid oak front door. I took my time. I slowly stood up from my leather chair, adjusted my robe, and walked deliberately down the long, quiet hallway. I unlocked the heavy titanium deadbolt and pulled the door open. The freezing wind immediately whipped into the warm foyer, carrying the sharp scent of the storm. Camille stood there shivering violently under the porch light, looking absolutely nothing like the arrogant, highly entitled woman who had confidently demanded 40% of my empire just 24 hours ago. As soon as the heavy wooden door opened, Camille completely collapsed. Her legs gave out and she dropped heavily to her knees on the freezing, waterlogged stone porch. She did not try to maintain her usual haughty composure. She instantly erupted into loud, uncontrollable, and highly hysterical sobbing. The heavy rain continued to blow sideways across the porch, soaking her completely, but I did not step aside to invite her into the warm, dry foyer. I stood perfectly still, looking down at her pathetic, shivering form. "Please, Dad, please," she wailed loudly. her voice cracking under the immense crushing weight of her absolute desperation. "You have to save us. You have to fix this right now." Bradley called me from the federal detention center. They are denying him standard release. The federal magistrate set his bail at $2 million cash, and all of our accounts are completely blocked. He cannot survive in a federal prison, Dad. He is absolutely terrified. They are treating him like a violent street criminal. She reached forward with her shaking hands, desperately trying to grab the hem of my robe, but I calmly took a deliberate step backward, keeping myself entirely out of her frantic reach. Her fake tears mixed heavily with the cold rain streaming down her face. "You have to pay the bail," she begged, her voice rising to a frantic, shrill scream. "You have millions of dollars just sitting in your private accounts. $2 million is absolutely nothing to you. You can quietly replace the missing pension money yourself, pay off the federal investigators, and make this entire nightmare go away. All of my friends have completely blocked my number. The local news stations are actively parking news vans at the end of my street. My entire social reputation is completely ruined. Please, I am your only daughter. You cannot just stand there and let them completely destroy my life over a simple financial mistake. You owe it to your family to protect us." She leaned forward, resting her wet forehead against the cold stone floor, crying so hard she was physically choking on her own breath. She was actively performing the role of a desperate, heartbroken child, but I saw right through the dramatic, watery display. She was not crying because her husband had callously stolen the retirement savings of innocent, hardworking people. She was not crying out of profound moral guilt or genuine remorse for actively covering up her mother's vile affair. She was crying exclusively for herself. She was mourning the sudden violent death of her unearned wealth and her fake social status. I watched her hyperventilate on the wet stone for a long, silent moment. I did not feel a single drop of paternal pity. I did not feel the sudden urge to reach down, pull her into a warm embrace, and tell her that her father would magically fix her massive self-inflicted disaster. The paternal instinct she was so desperately trying to manipulate had died the exact moment she proudly admitted to selling out my 35-year marriage for a fake $10 million investment. I reached into the deep pocket of my robe and pulled out a thick folded piece of paper. It was a summarized copy of the highly detailed forensic audit report that had officially sealed Bradley's fate. I held it out in the freezing rain. Camille slowly lifted her head, her mascara heavily smeared across her pale cheeks, and looked at the document. "Take it," I commanded, my voice cutting cleanly and sharply through the loud roaring of the storm. Her shaking, freezing fingers hesitantly reached up and took the damp paper. "I want you to look very closely at that final number at the bottom of the page," I said, my tone as cold and unforgiving as the concrete beneath her knees. "That is a $10 million federal embezzlement invoice. That is the exact amount of money your pathetic husband actively stole from the working-class men and women who physically built the very empire you have been arrogantly feeding off your entire life. Do not ever call this a simple financial mistake. It was a highly calculated, malicious, and entirely deliberate theft. And because you actively hid your mother's affair to ensure that stolen money continued to flow to Conrad Sinclair, you are legally and morally complicit in every single stolen dollar." Camille stared at the paper in absolute paralyzed horror as the rain quickly soaked through the thick fibers. "I am not paying a single penny of your husband's bail," I continued, speaking with a slow, surgical precision that offered absolutely zero room for negotiation or debate. "He will sit in that federal holding cell until the judge sentences him to 15 years in a maximum security penitentiary. Furthermore, I have officially dissolved your primary trust fund, revoked your inheritance, and entirely removed your name from every single corporate ledger attached to the Hayes family name. You are completely cut off. You no longer have a father to blindly absorb the massive consequences of your incredible greed. You chose your side, Camille. You chose to back a thief and a fraud over the man who gave you absolutely everything." Camille looked up at me, her eyes wide with a profound, suffocating terror, as she finally realized that her ultimate safety net was completely and permanently gone. "But how am I supposed to live?" she gasped loudly, her chest heaving in absolute panic. "How am I supposed to survive without the company accounts?" I looked down at her ruined designer dress and her entirely shattered ego. "You are going to do something you have never actually done in your entire 35 years of existence," I stated coldly. "You are going to get a real job. You are going to work for minimum wage, scrubbing floors, or serving food, and you are going to use every single meager paycheck you earn to slowly pay back the $10 million in pension funds you helped your husband steal. You will spend the rest of your miserable life trying to settle a debt you can never possibly clear. I took a step back into the warm, dry foyer of my secure home. I looked at my daughter one last time, feeling absolutely nothing but a quiet, enduring peace. "Get off my property," I commanded softly. I reached forward, grabbed the heavy brass handle, and forcefully pulled the solid oak door shut. The heavy titanium deadbolt clicked loudly into place, instantly sealing her out in the freezing, violent storm forever. I did not personally attend the delivery of the final divorce decree. I remained at my estate enjoying a quiet morning coffee while Mr. Goldstein handled the precise execution of the legal paperwork. Following her humiliating eviction from Conrad Sinclair's luxurious penthouse, Valerie had absolutely nowhere else to run. With her credit cards entirely frozen and her high society friends completely ignoring her desperate phone calls, she was forced to seek shelter at a highly run-down, incredibly cheap motel located on the industrial outskirts of the city. The contrast between the Michelin star restaurants she frequented 2 days ago and the damp-stained walls of the motel room was absolute poetry. Shortly after 8 o'clock in the morning, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed against the flimsy wooden door of her room. Valerie opened it cautiously. She was wearing the exact same clothes she had scavenged from the cardboard boxes we had dumped in Conrad's public lobby. Her hair was completely unkempt, and the arrogant, untouchable aura she usually projected was entirely gone. Mr. Goldstein stood on the cracked concrete walkway outside her room, wearing an immaculate tailored suit and holding a thick, securely sealed legal envelope. He did not offer her a polite greeting or ask how she was adjusting to her new living arrangements. He simply handed the heavy envelope directly to her, his expression as cold and unforgiving as a block of ice. "These are the finalized expedited divorce documents signed by a federal judge this morning," Goldstein stated firmly, stepping past her to briefly survey the pathetic state of the motel room. "I highly suggest you sit down before you read the primary settlement conditions." Valerie snatched the envelope from his hands, her eyes narrowing with a brief, desperate flash of her old entitlement. She honestly believed I was finally caving to her demands. She genuinely thought the envelope contained a massive alimony check to simply make her go away quietly. She ripped open the heavy seal and pulled out the thick stack of papers. Valerie rapidly flipped through the dense legal pages, frantically searching for the specific section outlining her monthly financial compensation. She expected to see a massive multi-million-dollar settlement. Instead, her eyes landed on a highly complex liability clause that made absolutely no sense to her. She looked up at Goldstein, her face twisting in pure frustration. "What is this garbage?" she demanded loudly, waving the papers in the air. "Where is the section detailing my 40% share of the commercial trust? Where is my monthly alimony payment? I am not signing anything until I see my money." Goldstein did not flinch at her aggressive tone. He simply smiled a cold, predatory grin that sent a sudden chill straight down her spine. "You are not getting a single penny, Valerie," he explained with absolute surgical precision. "Do you remember the highly aggressive divorce settlement you and Bradley violently slammed onto Vincent's desk during your little boardroom coup? In that specific document, you actively tried to legally separate Bradley's regional division from Vincent's primary corporate trust. You officially demanded a 50% personal ownership stake in Bradley's division, claiming it was a separate marital asset you helped build." Valerie stared at him, her breathing suddenly becoming very shallow. She had indeed signed that document, completely manipulated by Bradley, into believing it was a brilliant legal maneuver to secure her own independent wealth. "You proudly signed that legal demand in front of multiple witnesses." Goldstein continued, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "You legally established yourself as a 50% co-owner of that exact specific division. Unfortunately for you, we fully accepted that specific term of your proposal. We legally granted you half of Bradley's division. The problem, Valerie, is that Bradley's division does not actually have any money. As you are now painfully aware, your son-in-law spent the last 3 years actively embezzling $10 million from the employee pension fund through that exact corporate entity. Therefore, the division you aggressively fought to own does not hold any assets. It only holds massive federally mandated liabilities. You successfully sued for exactly half of a massive criminal enterprise. You thought you were outsmarting Vincent, but you were actually building your own financial prison. By legally attaching your name to Bradley's corporate structure, you completely bypass the protective firewall of Vincent's primary holding trust. You are no longer protected by his wealth. You are entirely exposed to the brutal consequences of Bradley's monumental theft. Valerie began to shake uncontrollably. The heavy legal papers felt like burning lead in her hands. "What are you saying?" she whispered, her voice cracking as the horrifying reality began to slowly crush her entire perceived reality. Goldstein stepped closer, ensuring every single word he spoke landed with maximum psychological impact. "I am saying that you are legally and personally responsible for 50% of the missing pension funds," he stated clearly. "Bradley stole $10 million because you are a legally documented half-owner of the division that facilitated the theft. You currently owe the federal government exactly $5 million in immediate restitution. The IRS has already been officially notified of your new financial liability status." Valerie dropped the papers onto the cheap motel bed. Her legs gave out and she sank onto the stained mattress. "But I do not have $5 million, she gasped frantically, tears of absolute panic welling up in her eyes. "All of my accounts are frozen. My cars were repossessed. I have absolutely nothing left." Goldstein nodded slowly, showing absolutely zero sympathy for the woman who had callously betrayed his oldest client. "That is exactly correct," he replied. "Because of the blatant documented infidelity and your active participation in corporate fraud, the judge entirely waived your right to any form of spousal support or alimony. You are walking away from a 35-year marriage with absolutely zero assets and a $5 million federal debt. The IRS will actively garnish any future wages you might miraculously earn. They will seize your Social Security payments. They will aggressively hunt down every single dollar you ever make for the rest of your natural life until that massive debt is fully paid. You are not just broke, Valerie. You are entirely financially obliterated. You will never be able to own a house, lease a car, or hold a standard bank account ever again." Vincent wanted me to personally deliver this message to you. He wanted you to fully understand the exact price of your profound arrogance. Goldstein turned his back on her, grasped the cheap metal door handle and opened the door. "Have a wonderful life, Valerie," he said without looking back, and walked away into the morning sun. Valerie sat completely alone in the silent, dingy motel room. The walls seemed to aggressively close in on her as she stared at the terrifying legal documents scattered across the cheap bedspread. She was suffocating under the crushing weight of a $5 million federal debt she could never possibly repay. In a state of absolute blind desperation, she snatched her cell phone from the nightstand. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely unlock the screen. She pulled up Conrad Sinclair's contact information. He was the man who had started this entire nightmare. He was the man who had confidently promised her a life of unlimited wealth and luxury. She firmly believed that even if he was evicted, a man of his supposed connections must have hidden assets or offshore accounts they could use to escape the country. She pressed the call button and pressed the phone hard against her ear, praying intensely for him to answer and save her. The line was completely dead for 3 agonizing seconds. Then a cold, automated robotic voice filled the speaker. "We are sorry," the operator announced mechanically. "The number you have reached has been permanently disconnected or is no longer in service." The phone slipped from her fingers, clattering loudly onto the cheap linoleum floor. She was completely and utterly alone. 3 weeks after the highly publicized federal arrests, the heavy mahogany doors of the downtown federal courthouse swung open to accommodate a highly unusual and deeply complex legal proceeding. Because Valerie had aggressively and legally demanded a 50% ownership stake in Bradley's corrupt regional division during her failed boardroom coup, her civil divorce settlement was entirely absorbed into the ongoing federal fraud investigation. We were no longer simply fighting over standard marital assets in a quiet family court. We were sitting in a massive wood-paneled federal courtroom overseen by a strictly uncompromising United States district judge. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Mr. Goldstein, wearing my standard immaculate yet entirely unremarkable gray suit. I watched Valerie walk into the courtroom, flanked by a team of highly expensive, desperate defense attorneys she had somehow convinced to work on contingency. She had completely abandoned her arrogant, high society persona. She was dressed in a remarkably plain, conservative gray dress, her hair pulled back into a simple bun, wearing absolutely zero jewelry and zero makeup. It was a highly calculated theatrical performance designed entirely to generate pity. Her lead defense attorney, a smooth-talking man who specialized in white-collar crime, immediately took the floor and began aggressively playing the manipulated older woman card. He paced slowly in front of the judge, gesturing sympathetically toward Valerie, who was actively forcing tears to fall down her pale cheeks. He painted a completely fictional portrait of a naive, deeply traditional housewife who was entirely ignorant of complex corporate finance. He passionately argued that Valerie was merely a passive victim, a vulnerable older woman who had been systematically brainwashed and emotionally manipulated by her younger, highly aggressive son-in-law and a predatory sociopathic hedge fund manager. He explicitly claimed she had absolutely no idea the $10 million in pension funds were stolen, and that her demand for 50% of the company was simply a confused, desperate attempt to secure her own retirement after decades of a supposedly loveless, financially restrictive marriage. I sat perfectly still listening to the defense attorney weave his elaborate web of absolute lies. The judge, a stern woman with decades of experience dismantling corporate fraud, listened patiently with an entirely unreadable expression. When the defense finally rested their pathetic opening argument, Mr. Goldstein stood up. He did not deliver a highly passionate, emotional speech. He simply adjusted his glasses, picked up a small digital drive from our table, and formally submitted it to the court clerk as our primary piece of physical evidence. "Your Honor," Goldstein said, his voice echoing cleanly through the massive, quiet courtroom. "The defense claims that Mrs. Hayes was a confused, passive victim who had no active understanding of her own financial demands. We would like to present high-definition security footage with synchronized audio legally subpoenaed directly from the downtown Cartier boutique, recorded on the exact afternoon she attempted to finalize her corporate coup." The lights in the courtroom dimmed slightly as the large flat-screen monitors mounted on the walls flickered to life. The crystal-clear video showed Valerie standing inside the luxury boutique draped over the arm of Conrad Sinclair. The audio picked up her voice with absolute terrifying clarity. The entire courtroom watched as Valerie proudly slapped her heavy metal Centurion card onto the glass counter. But it was the conversation she had with Conrad while waiting for the transaction to process that completely destroyed her entire legal defense. On the video, Valerie laughed maliciously explicitly, bragging to Conrad about the aggressive boardroom ambush she had just executed against me. "I backed that cheap, outdated old fool right into a corner," her recorded voice echoed loudly across the silent courtroom. "Bradley has the digital signatures locked down. By tomorrow, Vincent will be completely bankrupt and I will be spending his entire logistical empire on whatever I want. He can rot in a state-run nursing home for all I care." The video continued playing, showing her aggressive, highly entitled outrage when the black card was publicly declined. The footage definitively proved that Valerie was not a confused, manipulated victim. She was a highly calculating, deeply malicious conspirator who fully understood the hostile takeover and was eagerly anticipating my absolute financial and personal destruction. She was actively celebrating my orchestrated ruin to impress a man she thought was a billionaire. The video abruptly ended and the courtroom monitors went completely black. The silence in the massive room was absolute and incredibly suffocating. Valerie sat entirely frozen at the defense table, her face completely drained of blood, her fake tears instantly drying up. Her smooth-talking defense attorney slowly sank back into his leather chair, physically rubbing his temples, knowing instantly that his entire federal defense case had just been completely obliterated by his own client's recorded arrogance. The federal judge slowly took off her reading glasses and looked directly down at Valerie from the high wooden bench. The judge did not try to hide her absolute profound disgust. "Mrs. Hayes," the judge began, her voice dripping with a cold judicial fury that made the entire room completely tense. "I have presided over this federal court for 22 years, and I have rarely witnessed such a blatant, unapologetic display of sheer malicious greed. You actively attempted to legally blindside your husband of 35 years, you proudly conspired to strip him of his life's work, and you explicitly tied your own name to a corporate division that was actively robbing innocent working-class people of their hard-earned retirement pensions. You did not do this out of confusion, you did it out of profound arrogance." The judge picked up her heavy wooden gavel. "Therefore, I am immediately dismissing every single one of your claims to the primary marital assets. You will receive absolutely zero alimony, zero spousal support, and zero access to the Hayes family commercial trusts. Furthermore, because you legally and aggressively asserted 50% ownership of the corrupt regional division during your documented boardroom extortion attempt, this court formally holds you equally liable for the missing federal funds. You owe $5 million in immediate federal restitution. To begin satisfying this massive debt, I am ordering federal marshals to immediately seize and liquidate all of your personal luxury assets. Every single designer gown, every diamond necklace, every luxury handbag you accumulated during your marriage will be aggressively auctioned off by the state. You are leaving this courtroom with absolutely nothing but the clothes currently on your back. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down with a violent, deafening crack that echoed like a gunshot through the federal courtroom. Valerie let out a highly pathetic, entirely broken gasp. Her legs gave out completely as she tried to stand, forcing her expensive defense attorneys to physically hold her upright by her arms. She looked across the wide aisle at me, her eyes wide with a suffocating absolute terror. She was desperately searching my face for a single drop of the unconditional mercy I had shown her for the past 35 years. She found absolutely nothing. I looked back at her with the cold, detached expression of a man staring at a complete stranger. Two armed federal court officers immediately approached the defense table, flanking Valerie on both sides. They did not put her in handcuffs, but they forcefully guided her away from the table, aggressively marching her down the long center aisle of the courtroom. She stumbled over her own feet, entirely stripped of her wealth, her fake social status, and her fundamental human dignity. The heavy mahogany doors swung open to reveal a massive crowd of local reporters waiting aggressively in the hallway. I sat perfectly still beside Mr. Goldstein, listening to the chaotic shouts of the media completely swallow her as the doors slowly closed behind her. The surgical removal of the parasite was finally complete. The night after Valerie's spectacular collapse in federal court, Conrad Sinclair was experiencing a massive fall from grace of his own. The man who had once thrown a crumpled dollar bill at my chest and boasted loudly about his non-existent billion-dollar hedge fund was currently standing in a grimy, fluorescent-lit Greyhound bus terminal on the wrong side of the city. He was wearing a cheap, unmarked hoodie pulled low over his face and a pair of faded jeans he had likely scavenged from a thrift store. The custom velvet tuxedos and Italian leather shoes were permanently gone, legally seized by my property management company to satisfy a fraction of his massive delinquent rent. Conrad was sweating profusely, nervously clutching a battered canvas duffel bag containing the very last of his hidden cash. He had completely drained a secret emergency account just to scrape together enough money for a one-way bus ticket across state lines, desperately hoping to disappear into the rural Midwest before the federal indictments officially dropped. He cautiously approached the ticket counter, constantly glancing over his shoulder, terrified of every sudden movement in the crowded, dirty terminal. He slid a crumpled pile of $20 bills across the scratched glass, explicitly asking for the next departure to anywhere out of state. He did not even get the chance to grab his printed ticket. 3 plainclothes federal agents who had been quietly tracking his burner phone for the last 48 hours seamlessly moved through the crowd. They flanked him silently. Before Conrad could even react, a heavy hand firmly gripped his shoulder, spinning him violently away from the counter. The agent slammed him face first against the reinforced glass of the ticket booth, instantly snapping cold steel handcuffs around his wrists, while the surrounding late-night travelers watched the arrest in shocked silence. His desperate attempt to run had officially failed. Conrad was transported directly to the heavily fortified downtown Federal Building, the exact same facility where Bradley was currently being held without bail. The federal investigators did not waste their time playing games. They placed Conrad in a stark, freezing interrogation room, bolted him to the heavy steel chair, and dropped a massive stack of financial documents directly in front of his face. The lead investigator clearly outlined the severe reality of his situation. Conrad was facing multiple counts of wire fraud, grand larceny, and direct complicity in the theft of a federally protected employee pension fund. The prosecutor explicitly promised a mandatory minimum of 20 years in a maximum security penitentiary if he refused to fully cooperate. Conrad Sinclair, the man who had built his entire adult life on projecting an aura of fearless power and untouchable wealth, completely broke in less than 15 minutes. He did not possess a single ounce of genuine loyalty or personal honor. He realized instantly that his only possible path to a reduced sentence was to aggressively point the finger at the man who had actually executed the theft. Conrad eagerly waived his right to legal counsel and immediately turned state's evidence. He sang like a desperate, terrified canary. He painted an elaborate, entirely self-serving picture of the entire operation, loudly testifying that he was merely a passive financial consultant who had been aggressively manipulated by Bradley. Conrad explicitly claimed that Bradley was the absolute mastermind behind the entire embezzlement scheme. He detailed exactly how Bradley had exploited his executive clearance within my logistics company to bypass the central security firewalls and violently drain the employee pension accounts. Conrad actively provided the federal agents with the exact dates of their secret meetings, the specific burner phone numbers they used to communicate, and the exact offshore routing codes Bradley had used to funnel the $10 million into the fake hedge fund accounts. Conrad practically begged the federal agents for immunity, violently throwing my son-in-law entirely under the bus to save his own pathetic skin. He handed them every single piece of evidence they needed to bury Bradley forever. He even provided crystal-clear audio recordings he had secretly made during their private dinners, recordings where Bradley arrogantly bragged about outsmarting me and securing his financial independence. Conrad proved to the federal government that there is absolutely no honor among thieves. He was fully prepared to let the younger man rot in a concrete cell for the rest of his natural life, so long as he could walk away with a heavily reduced sentence and a chance to run another scam in the distant future. The federal prosecutors were incredibly efficient. The very next morning, they walked directly into Bradley's holding cell and laid Conrad's entire sworn testimony and the secret audio transcripts directly on his narrow metal cot. Bradley sat in his bright orange jumpsuit, completely unshaven and trembling violently as he read the devastating documents. He realized with absolute crushing horror that the wealthy mentor he had worshipped, the fake billionaire he had actively stolen $10 million to impress, had completely betrayed him without a single second of hesitation. The overwhelming panic that had consumed Bradley since his public arrest at the press conference suddenly morphed into a vicious, burning, and completely unhinged rage. He realized he was staring down the barrel of a multi-decade prison sentence while Conrad was actively negotiating a comfortable plea deal. Bradley was a deeply arrogant and entitled man, but he was also incredibly vindictive when cornered. If he was going down in flames, he was absolutely determined to drag Conrad straight into the fire with him. Bradley immediately demanded a formal meeting with the lead federal prosecutor. When the agents brought him into the interrogation room, Bradley did not ask for a lawyer or attempt to deny his own involvement. Instead, he aggressively unleashed his own devastating counterattack. During the course of their illicit partnership, Bradley had been secretly gathering his own highly sensitive leverage. He actively wanted a solid insurance policy just in case the fake billionaire ever tried to cut him out of the massive corporate profits. Bradley handed the federal agents a hidden digital drive he had explicitly instructed his lawyer to retrieve from a secure locker earlier that morning. This drive contained the absolute unredacted truth about Sinclair Global Capital. Bradley provided the FBI with irrefutable hard evidence of Conrad's massive offshore tax evasion network, detailing millions of dollars Conrad had actively hidden from the federal government over the last 10 years through illegal shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Bradley also handed over highly classified documents proving that Conrad had previously defrauded 3 other major corporate entities before targeting my logistics company. He systematically destroyed Conrad's carefully constructed plea deal by explicitly proving that Conrad was not a manipulated victim, but a career predator who actively orchestrated international fraud. The sheer arrogance of these 2 men was ultimately their absolute undoing. They had spent the entire year confidently believing they were the smartest people in the room, constantly mocking my frugal lifestyle and my quiet demeanor while they recklessly gambled with my money. But when the absolute reality of their massive crimes finally crashed down upon them, their fake alliance completely shattered. They turned into rabid dogs, viciously tearing each other to pieces in a desperate, entirely pathetic attempt to survive the consequences of their own actions. Their mutual betrayal was so incredibly thorough and heavily documented that the federal prosecutors immediately pulled both of their highly generous plea deals entirely off the table. The federal judge looked at the massive mountain of irrefutable evidence they had eagerly handed over against each other and completely threw the book at both of them. There would be no reduced sentences and no comfortable minimum security facilities. The 2 highly arrogant men who thought they could easily outsmart me, steal my empire, and ruin my life ended up completely destroying themselves effectively, guaranteeing each other mandatory 15-year sentences in a maximum security federal penitentiary. 6 months had passed since the heavy mahogany doors of the federal courthouse permanently sealed Valerie's fate. Stripped of all her luxury assets, entirely evicted from her cheap industrial motel, and carrying a massive $5 million federal restitution debt, she had completely fallen off the edge of the elite social world she once blindly worshipped. I knew exactly where she was because I always make it my absolute business to know the exact position of my enemies. My corporate acquisition team had recently and very quietly purchased a massive portfolio of severely run-down commercial properties located on the harsh, unforgiving industrial outskirts of the city. Valerie was currently employed in building number 4, working the grueling, back-breaking midnight shift as a low-level maintenance janitor. Her once perfectly manicured hands, which had previously swiped unlimited black credit cards at exclusive Cartier boutiques, were now heavily cracked, permanently blistered, and constantly soaked in cheap, harsh industrial bleach. She wore a baggy, highly unflattering dark blue canvas uniform with a faded plastic name tag securely pinned to her chest pocket. Every single night for 10 exhausting hours, she pushed a heavy, violently squeaking yellow mop bucket across endless acres of dirty linoleum floors. She was entirely trapped in a brutal, inescapable cycle of absolute poverty. Because the federal government aggressively garnished 70% of her minimum wage paycheck to slowly satisfy her massive IRS liability, she was forcefully reduced to living in a cramped, windowless basement apartment she rented by the week. The glamorous, untouchable high society queen who had cruelly laughed at my simple suits and publicly discarded 35 years of my silent sacrifice was now a completely invisible, faceless laborer. She was an absolute ghost, haunting the very bottom of the economic ladder, entirely ignored and frequently insulted by the wealthy executives who walked past her every single morning without a second glance. At precisely 11:30 that night, the aggressive building manager marched directly into the dimly lit main lobby where Valerie was currently working. He was a loud, unforgiving, and deeply unpleasant man who treated his minimum wage maintenance staff with the exact same harsh, condescending cruelty Valerie had proudly used to inflict upon retail workers and restaurant servers during her prime. He aggressively clapped his large hands together, the sharp, violent sound echoing loudly across the empty commercial foyer. "Listen up and listen carefully," the manager barked loudly, pointing a thick, accusing finger directly at Valerie's face. The massive international logistics and real estate conglomerate that just bought this entire commercial block is conducting a highly unusual, entirely unannounced midnight executive inspection. The new billionaire owner of the parent company is personally walking through these front doors in exactly 30 minutes. "I want this main lobby floor completely spotless. You are going to scrub the linoleum twice. If I see a single streak of dirt, a single water spot, or a single piece of trash, when that powerful man walks in here, you are fired immediately on the spot." Valerie felt a freezing cold wave of absolute, terrifying panic wash over her exhausted body. Losing this miserable, deeply humiliating job meant she would immediately face total starvation and absolute street homelessness. She did not dare to argue or complain about the agonizing shooting pain currently radiating through her lower back. She frantically grabbed her stiff, bristled hand, scrubbing brush, entirely abandoning the rolling mop. She physically dropped to her hands and knees on the hard, freezing floor, desperately scrubbing the stubborn black scuff marks out of the cheap commercial tile. She breathed heavily salty sweat stinging her eyes as she frantically pushed the rough brush back and forth. She was completely terrified of the wealthy billionaire owner she was about to face. She desperately wanted to remain entirely invisible, praying she could simply blend into the background shadows when the corporate inspection team finally arrived. The heavy digital clock mounted on the wall of the distant security office silently flipped to midnight. Valerie was still down on her hands and knees in the exact center of the main lobby, desperately wiping away a small, stubborn pool of soapy water with a frayed gray rag. The heavy automatic glass doors at the main front entrance suddenly slid open with a soft, highly expensive mechanical hum. A rush of cool, crisp night air instantly swept into the harsh fluorescent lighting of the foyer. Valerie froze completely in place. She heard the distinct, incredibly confident sound of multiple heavy footsteps stepping in unison onto the hard tile floor. She was far too terrified to look up, keeping her head bowed submissively toward the ground, desperately hoping the wealthy executives would simply walk past her kneeling form without offering a second glance. But the heavy footsteps did not pass her by. They advanced deliberately across the room. A pair of impeccably polished, custom-made black Italian leather shoes stepped directly into her immediate line of sight, stopping just inches away from her soaking wet rag. These were not the cheap, outdated, off-the-rack shoes of a humble logistics manager. They were the highly expensive, perfectly crafted footwear of an absolute corporate king who commanded absolute authority. Valerie's breath violently caught in her throat. She slowly raised her heavy head, her tired eyes tracing the sharp, flawless crease of the tailored midnight blue suit trousers standing before her. She looked past the expensive imported silk tie and the gleaming platinum tie clip, finally forcing herself to look directly into the face of the billionaire owner who now entirely controlled her absolute livelihood. Her heart stopped completely in her chest. The blood instantly drained from her pale face. It was me. I stood towering over her, flanked evenly by Mr. Goldstein and four of my top senior corporate executives. I was not wearing my old frayed gray suit. I radiated absolute undeniable power and immense untouchable wealth. Valerie's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror as her exhausted brain desperately tried to process the mathematically impossible reality currently standing directly in front of her. I did not say a single word to her. I simply raised my right hand slightly, a silent, highly commanding gesture that instantly froze my entire executive team in place behind me. The aggressive building manager who had been rushing forward to eagerly and pathetically greet me stopped dead in his tracks, completely silenced by my dominant presence. The silence in the massive commercial lobby was entirely absolute and completely deafening. I looked straight down at the pathetic, violently shivering woman kneeling directly in the dirty, soapy water at my expensive feet. I looked meticulously at her cracked, bleeding hands, her stained and baggy blue canvas uniform, and the absolute suffocating terror radiating violently from her wide, bloodshot eyes. This was the exact same arrogant woman who had callously thrown away 4 solid decades of my unconditional loyalty, my quiet protection, and my immense hidden wealth for the cheap, completely fraudulent illusion of a fake hedge fund manager. She had actively conspired to completely destroy me and leave me homeless, and now she was literally scrubbing the dirt off the floors of a building I had casually purchased with my spare corporate change. She stared up at me, entirely paralyzed by the crushing, inescapable weight of her own monumental mistake. The silence inside the vast commercial lobby was so absolute it felt heavy enough to crush bone. The only sound in the entire massive space was the low, steady mechanical hum of the harsh fluorescent lights hanging high above our heads. Valerie remained frozen on her hands and knees in the dirty, soapy water. She did not dare to move a single muscle. She simply stared up at my face with wide, bloodshot eyes, her chest heaving erratically under her stained blue canvas uniform. Her cracked, bleeding hands gripped the cheap plastic scrubbing brush so tightly her knuckles were completely white. She was waiting for the explosion. After 35 years of marriage, she fully expected me to finally break my stoic composure. She was bracing herself for a massive, highly public screaming match. She expected me to ruthlessly gloat, to loudly point out her disgusting uniform, to humiliate her in front of my elite executive team and the terrified building manager. But I did not give her the satisfaction of an emotional reaction. I did not mock her. I did not yell. I simply looked down at her with the cold, entirely detached observation of a man inspecting a broken piece of machinery. The complete absence of my anger was far more terrifying to her than any shouting could have ever been. My silence proved that the deep, unconditional love I had harbored for her over 4 decades was not just damaged. It was entirely dead. I felt absolutely nothing for the shivering, pathetic woman kneeling at my feet. She was no longer my wife, no longer my partner, and no longer my problem. She was simply an anonymous employee, failing to keep my floors clean. Valerie continued to stare up at me, her lower lip trembling violently. For a brief, incredibly delusional second, a tiny spark of desperate hope flickered deep inside her exhausted eyes. She looked at my incredibly expensive tailored suit and the undeniable power I commanded in that room. In her completely shattered mind, she actually thought I might have orchestrated this entire midnight inspection simply to find her. She genuinely believed that my arrival was a twisted rescue mission. She thought I was finally going to reach down, pull her up from the freezing floor, forgive her monumental betrayal, and invite her back into the luxurious, protected fortress of my massive wealth. I saw that pathetic flicker of hope, and I moved to extinguish it permanently. I slowly unbuttoned the front of my midnight blue suit jacket. I reached my right hand smoothly into the inner breast pocket. Valerie watched my hand intensely, her breathing hitching in her throat. She was fully expecting me to pull out a massive check, a set of keys to a new luxury apartment, or a legal document completely erasing her crushing $5 million federal debt. Instead, I pulled out a single heavily creased piece of paper. I held it between my index and middle fingers, bringing it out into the harsh fluorescent light. It was not a check. It was the exact same crumpled $1 bill Conrad Sinclair had aggressively thrown at my chest on the night of the High Society Charity Gala. I had kept it safely tucked away in my office safe for the last 6 months. I did not keep it out of misplaced sentimentality. I kept it as a permanent physical receipt of the exact moment my marriage ended. I wanted to constantly remind myself of the incredibly cheap, entirely fraudulent illusion Valerie had willingly chosen over my decades of silent sacrifice. As I held the wrinkled green paper up for her to clearly see, Valerie instantly recognized it. The desperate, pathetic flicker of hope in her eyes was instantly violently extinguished, entirely replaced by a profound, sickening wave of pure realization. She remembered the glamorous ballroom, the vintage champagne, and the cruel, mocking laugh she had aimed at me when she walked away on the arm of a fake billionaire. I held the crumpled dollar bill perfectly still for a long, agonizing moment, forcing her to look directly at the physical embodiment of her absolute foolishness. She had traded an international corporate empire, a pristine social reputation, and a family that loved her deeply for a man who could not even afford his own rent. She had participated in the ruthless theft of $10 million from innocent, hardworking people, completely destroying her own daughter's future, and sending her son-in-law to a maximum security federal prison, all to secure a lifestyle she already secretly owned through me. The sheer terrifying magnitude of her catastrophic miscalculation hit her with the brutal force of a speeding freight train. Her shoulders slumped forward and a single heavy tear escaped her eye, tracing a clean line down her dirty, sweat-stained cheek. I did not offer her a tissue. I did not offer her a single ounce of comfort. I slowly moved my hand directly over her bright yellow, violently squeaking plastic mop bucket. The water inside the bucket was a dark, filthy gray, swirling with toxic industrial bleach and the thick black grime she had just scrubbed off my commercial floors. I opened my fingers. I let the crumpled $1 bill fall. It fluttered slowly through the cold air, twisting gently before landing directly onto the surface of the filthy, toxic water. The cheap paper instantly soaked up the dark grime floating pathetically among the thick soap scum and the floating dirt. I looked directly into Valerie's wide, completely devastated eyes. My voice was incredibly calm, perfectly steady, and devoid of any human warmth. "This is the exact value of your betrayal," I stated, my words cutting sharply through the absolute silence of the commercial lobby. "Buy yourself a coffee." The words hit her harder than any physical blow ever could. It was the exact same deeply insulting phrase her fake billionaire lover had arrogantly used to humiliate me in front of the city's elite. But coming from my mouth, standing inside a massive building I completely owned while she scrubbed the floors for minimum wage, the phrase carried the heavy, undeniable weight of an absolute execution. The transaction was officially complete. She had sold her soul for a single worthless dollar, and now she was drowning in the exact same filth. I did not wait for her to formulate a desperate apology. I did not care to hear her beg for a mercy she entirely forfeited months ago. I simply turned my back on her. I gave a sharp, subtle nod to my senior corporate executives, entirely dismissing the pathetic scene. We resumed our confident, heavy strides across the massive lobby, walking straight toward the private executive elevators. The terrified building manager scrambled frantically to keep pace with us, completely ignoring his ruined janitor kneeling in the dirty water. Behind me, the absolute finality of my departure finally broke Valerie's mind. I heard the sharp, violent sound of her completely collapsing. She slumped heavily against the side of the dirty plastic mop cart, knocking the wet scrubbing brush across the hard tile. A loud, entirely agonizing wail echoed off the high glass walls of the foyer. It was the raw, uncontrollable sobbing of a woman who had finally been entirely crushed by the inescapable reality of her own irreversible ruin. I stepped into the gleaming elevator, leaving her alone in the dark. The crisp morning air carried the scent of dew and blooming jasmine as I stepped out onto the expansive stone balcony of my estate. It was barely 5 in the morning and the world was entirely quiet. I held a steaming mug of dark roast coffee in my hands, feeling the comforting warmth seep into my skin against the morning chill. I walked over to the heavy iron railing and looked out over the sweeping, manicured lawns stretching toward the distant tree line. The sun was just beginning to break over the horizon, casting a brilliant, warm, golden glow across the property. The violent storms of the past 6 months, both literal and metaphorical, had completely passed. My house, which had once been a suffocating fortress of fake smiles, ungrateful demands, and hidden betrayals, was finally silent. It was a profound, deeply healing silence. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, savoring the rich, bitter taste. For 4 decades, I had woken up in this exact house feeling the crushing weight of obligation pressing down on my chest. I had spent every single morning worrying about maintaining an illusion of happiness for a wife who despised my simplicity and a daughter who actively plotted my financial ruin. I had allowed myself to become a silent bank account, a human shield absorbing their endless mistakes and financing their monumental arrogance. But as the bright morning sun bathed the stone balcony in light, I realized that heavy, suffocating weight was completely gone. I breathed in deeply, filling my lungs with the fresh, clean air. My shoulders were relaxed. My mind was entirely clear. I was 69 years old, standing completely alone on a massive estate, and for the very first time in my adult life, I felt truly and absolutely free. Society constantly dictates that family is absolute. We are conditioned from a very young age to believe that blood ties demand unconditional forgiveness, endless sacrifice, and perpetual tolerance. We are told to turn the other cheek when our own flesh and blood betrays us simply because they share our last name. I completely reject that deeply flawed philosophy. As I watched the morning light slowly illuminate the distant city skyline, I reflected heavily on the brutal choices I had made over the last 6 months. I had permanently frozen my wife out of her luxurious existence, forcing her to scrub floors to pay a massive federal debt. I had deliberately allowed my daughter to be entirely cut off from my empire, leaving her to face the harsh reality of minimum wage survival. I had handed the federal government the exact evidence they needed to lock my son-in-law away in a maximum security prison for the next 15 years. Many people looking from the outside might view my actions as entirely cold, ruthless, and incredibly cruel. They might call me a vindictive old man who destroyed his own family over money, but they would be completely wrong. Excising Valerie, Camille, and Bradley from my life was not an act of cruelty. It was an act of profound, necessary self-respect. You cannot heal a body while actively feeding a cancer. My family had become a highly toxic parasitic infection that was actively destroying the very foundation of my life's work and hurting the innocent people who depended on me. They did not love me. They loved the absolute convenience of my quiet wealth. Forgiving their coordinated malicious betrayal would not have made me a noble patriarch. It would have simply made me a willing victim. I refused to die a victim in my own house. I chose to cleanly amputate the diseased limbs so the rest of the tree could actually survive. True peace cannot ever be bought with expensive jewelry, designer dresses, or offshore bank accounts. True peace is earned by having the absolute courage to walk away from anyone who disrespects your fundamental human dignity, regardless of how long you have known them or what titles they hold in your life. I turned away from the rising sun and walked back inside the warm house, stepping directly into my private study. The heavy mahogany desk where Valerie and Bradley had aggressively attempted to extort me months ago was completely clear save for a single thick leather binder. I sat down in my chair and opened the binder. Inside was the finalized, heavily audited financial recovery report. The federal government, through their extensive asset seizures and aggressive liquidations of Sinclair Global Capital, had successfully recovered the entire $10 million stolen from my employee pension fund. I had already ensured every single worker was fully compensated and their retirement accounts were completely restored with an additional corporate matching bonus. But the recovered $10 million sitting in the primary corporate holding account needed a permanent, meaningful destination. I picked up my favorite vintage fountain pen. I did not return the money to the logistics division. Instead, I carefully signed my name at the bottom of a highly complex legal trust document. With a few deliberate strokes of my pen, I permanently transferred the entire $10 million into a newly established, fully independent educational foundation. The fund was explicitly designed to provide full-ride university scholarships, housing stipends, and dedicated corporate mentorship programs for highly driven, underprivileged African-American youth from my old neighborhood. I wanted to actively build a legacy rooted in genuine generational progress, rather than the fake, fragile prestige my wife and daughter had so desperately craved. The money that was stolen to finance a fraudulent billionaire's luxurious lifestyle was now going to actively build the futures of young men and women who truly understood the value of hard work. I closed the leather binder with a firm, highly satisfying thud. My empire was finally completely clean. Sometimes the trash takes itself out if you just leave the door open. I did not have to actively destroy Valerie Conrad Camille or Bradley. I simply handed them the exact rope they eagerly used to hang themselves. Their own boundless greed, massive arrogance, and complete lack of fundamental morality did all the heavy lifting. I merely stood completely aside and allowed the absolute consequences of their own vicious actions to finally catch up with them. Now, my logistics company is stronger and more unified than ever before. My dedicated employees are entirely secure, and I am living the rest of my natural days surrounded by absolute tranquility and genuine, unbreakable purpose. I am living proof that you do not have to accept blatant disrespect just because you share a long history with someone. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Would you have shown them mercy or let them drown in their own greed? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of silent justice. There is one final critical lesson buried deep within the absolute wreckage of my family, a profound truth that extends far beyond the simple betrayal of a marriage or the theft of corporate funds. As I sit here in the quiet aftermath of the storm surrounded by the untouchable empire I built with my own two hands, I realize that the true villain in this entire tragedy was not just basic human greed. The ultimate destroyer of Valerie Camille Bradley and Conrad was their absolute fatal addiction to the illusion of public perception. The most dangerous disease infecting modern society is the desperate, all-consuming desire to appear wealthy, successful, and powerful to a world composed entirely of strangers who simply do not care about you. My family willingly traded the unbreakable concrete of a genuine foundation for the fragile, transparent glass of performative success. They did not just want to be rich. They desperately needed an audience to applaud their perceived riches. And that desperate need for applause is exactly what blinded them to the invisible traps they were actively walking into. Consider the sheer breathtaking foolishness of Conrad Sinclair. Here was a man who legally owned absolutely nothing. He did not own the sprawling penthouse he slept in. He did not own the aggressive sports car he drove, and he certainly did not own the millions of dollars he casually used to seduce my wife. He was a master architect of empty facades. He spent every single ounce of his energy and every stolen dollar he could acquire simply building a theatrical set. When he stood in that crowded charity ballroom and threw a crumpled $1 bill at my chest, he was not executing a strategic financial maneuver. He was performing a highly choreographed scene for the surrounding high society guests. He needed the elite crowd to look at him and see an untouchable billionaire putting a frugal, outdated old man in his proper place. His entire existence was a desperate performance designed to mask the terrifying reality of his own absolute failure. But a theatrical set is entirely hollow. It has no structural integrity. The moment the harsh wind of actual reality blows, the painted canvas immediately rips, the wooden props violently collapse, and the actor is left standing completely naked on an empty stage. Conrad went to federal prison not because he was a brilliant criminal mastermind, but because he was a pathetic actor who actually started to believe his own fictional script. Valerie was equally infected by this terminal disease of perception. For 35 years, she was legally married to a man who possessed the actual financial power to buy entire city blocks in cash. She had access to a level of generational wealth that most people cannot even begin to comprehend. But my wealth was entirely silent. It was carefully buried in offshore trusts shielded by anonymous holding corporations and legally protected by ironclad corporate structures. My wealth did not scream for attention. It did not demand the absolute envy of her country club friends or require flashing a diamond necklace at a Michelin star restaurant. Because my power was entirely invisible, Valerie fundamentally believed it was completely worthless. She was utterly incapable of finding joy in true financial security unless she could aggressively weaponize that security to make other women deeply jealous. When Conrad offered her the flashy, loud, and entirely fake version of wealth, she abandoned a solid mountain of gold to violently chase a shiny piece of tinfoil blowing in the wind. She wanted the immediate intoxicating validation of walking into a luxury boutique and dropping $50,000 on a watch simply to watch the retail workers bow to her. She traded her fundamental dignity, her secure future, and her absolute peace of mind just to maintain an artificial image. Now she spends her midnights scrubbing the black scuff marks off my commercial floors, completely invisible to the exact same society she once desperately tried to impress. The audience she destroyed her entire life to entertain does not even know her name anymore. The same fatal flaw entirely consumed my son-in-law Bradley. He possessed a highly prestigious Ivy League degree, a piece of heavy parchment that technically certified his advanced education. But an education is completely useless if it is not firmly anchored to a foundation of actual grinding hard work. Bradley did not want to endure the grueling, unglamorous years required to actually build a successful logistics division from the ground up. He did not want to study the tedious supply chain metrics, negotiate the complex labor contracts, or actively manage the gritty daily operations of the warehouses. He only wanted the corner office with the panoramic city view. He only wanted the heavy mahogany desk, the tailored Italian suits, and the highly intimidating title of regional director printed on a heavy cardstock business card. He wanted the absolute privilege of leadership without bearing a single ounce of the crushing responsibility. When his division inevitably began to fail because of his profound laziness and absolute incompetence, he did not humble himself and ask for my guidance. He chose to actively steal $10 million from the innocent working-class people who actually kept the company functioning. He stole their retirement futures simply to cover up his own failure and maintain the illusion of his corporate genius. He was terrified that his high society friends and his entitled wife would finally realize he was completely hollow. He traded 15 years of his physical freedom in a maximum security penitentiary just to avoid the temporary, entirely survivable embarrassment of a failed business venture. This entire tragedy firmly cemented my belief in the incredible, unmatched strategic power of intentional invisibility. Throughout this entire ordeal, my greatest weapon was not my team of ruthless corporate lawyers, my forensic accountants, or my massive bank accounts. My absolute greatest weapon was the faded 10-year-old gray suit I wore every single day. My greatest advantage was the rattling engine of my 20-year-old Ford truck. By actively choosing to project an image of simple, unpretentious frugality, I successfully filtered the entire world around me. When you do not constantly broadcast your power, you force people to reveal their absolute true characters. Arrogant people will immediately assume you are weak and attempt to step on you. Greedy people will aggressively ignore you because they believe you have nothing to offer them. Manipulative people will drop their carefully constructed masks because they do not view you as a legitimate threat to their plans. My simple suit acted as a perfect, flawless mirror reflecting the absolute ugliness of everyone around me, because they all believed I was just a tired, outdated old man clinging to a stagnant logistics company they operated with absolute reckless impunity right in front of my face. They handed me the exact blueprints to their own destruction because they never once stopped to consider that the quiet man sitting in the corner was actually the master architect of the entire building. The ultimate lesson you must take away from my story is the absolute necessity of building your life in the dark. Do not ever let your lifestyle loudly announce your victories before your foundation is entirely secure. The modern world constantly pressures you to relentlessly document your success, to post the pictures of the luxury cars, to check into the exclusive resorts, and to aggressively prove your absolute worth to a timeline full of strangers. You must completely resist that toxic self-destructive urge. Every single ounce of energy you spend trying to convince other people that you are powerful is an ounce of energy you are actively stealing from your own actual growth. Real power never has to raise its voice. Real power never has to aggressively demand respect at a dinner table or flash a heavy metal credit card to feel validated. True wealth is the absolute unshakable quiet in your mind when you wake up in the morning knowing that you own the ground you are standing on. True wealth is the profound ability to simply walk away from any table where respect is no longer being served without having to worry about how you are going to pay for your next meal. When you prioritize ownership over appearance, you become completely untouchable. I did not care that the high society guests at the charity gala laughed at my cheap suit when Conrad threw that dollar bill at me. Their laughter meant absolutely nothing to me because I mathematically knew that I owned the literal concrete pillars supporting the roof over their heads. I knew that their entire perceived reality was actively being subsidized by my silent labor. When you actually own the infrastructure, you never have to worry about the opinions of the people simply renting space inside it. You must strive to be the man who owns the bank, not the man who desperately takes out a massive loan just to buy a flashy car to park in front of it. You must be completely willing to look poor, to look outdated, and to look absolutely unremarkable while you are quietly accumulating the assets that will eventually guarantee your permanent freedom. The applause of the crowd is incredibly loud, but it is also entirely fleeting. It vanishes the exact second the stage lights turn off. but a properly structured deed, an ironclad corporate trust, and a legally protected asset portfolio will continue to silently generate power long after the crowd has gone home. My family mocked my quiet, disciplined life, completely failing to understand that discipline is the absolute highest form of self-love. I denied myself the temporary, shallow pleasures of public boasting so I could permanently secure my independence. I absorbed their insults, their eye rolls, and their condescending remarks in absolute silence because a lion does not ever need to roar to prove he is a lion. A lion simply waits for the exact perfect moment to strike. When that precise moment finally arrived, I did not have to scream, throw tantrums, or engage in pathetic emotional arguments. I simply executed a series of entirely cold, mathematical, and legally binding decisions. I turned off the financial tap. I exposed the hidden paper trail. I revoked the corporate access. I let the absolute gravity of their own terrible choices violently pull them down into the abyss. I watched their entire artificial kingdom completely collapse into dust in a matter of days, simply because the invisible pillars holding it up were finally removed. You must learn to ruthlessly guard your inner peace and your assets from the parasites who will inevitably attempt to attach themselves to your success. Do not ever confuse longevity with loyalty. Just because someone has lived in your house for 35 years does not mean they actually respect the man who built it. Just because someone shares your exact DNA does not mean they will not hesitate to actively sacrifice your future to secure their own comfort. You must carefully and constantly evaluate the actual character of the people standing in your inner circle. Are they standing next to you because they genuinely value your mind, your spirit, and your mutual journey? Or are they simply standing in your shadow to completely avoid the harsh, blinding heat of the sun? If you ever discover that the people closest to you are merely feeding off your resources while secretly despising your existence, you must possess the absolute unflinching courage to cleanly sever the cord. You cannot ever be afraid of the resulting silence. The sudden absence of a toxic person is not a loss. It is a massive, immediate addition to your overall peace of mind. I am now living the absolute best years of my entire life. I wake up every single morning with a perfectly clear conscience and an entirely unburdened soul. The money I recovered from my cowardly son-in-law is currently sending brilliant, deserving young students to the best universities in the country. My logistics company is thriving, entirely managed by loyal, hardworking executives who actually earned their heavy mahogany desks through years of dedicated service. I am completely surrounded by the profound, untouchable peace that only comes from knowing you survived the absolute worst betrayal imaginable and emerged entirely victorious without ever compromising your fundamental dignity. I did not have to become a screaming, irrational monster to defeat the monsters in my own home. I simply remained the quiet, calculating, and entirely immovable mountain I had always been, and I watched the violent storm break itself completely apart against my solid stone walls. Never trade your solid, permanent reality for a cheap, temporary illusion, and never let the desperate desire for applause distract you from quietly building your empire in the absolute dark. Let me know in the comments below what invisible foundation you are currently building to protect your own future, and hit that subscribe button if you are ready to permanently stop performing for crowds that simply do not matter.